honestly not sure where to even begin with this. It's been, well, almost a year to the day now, and I still can't fully understand or comprehend what happened that day. Neither have I been able to fully get over it. I've floated from one psychologist and psychiatrist to another, all which tell me that what I experienced couldn't possibly have occurred. And yet, as much as they try to make my mind believe that, both with words and medication, as much as I try and make my mind believe it wasn't real, I know deep inside myself that it was. So I'm choosing to post my account of this here, both as a, admittedly, rather pathetic attempt to release some of the guilt and horror that I've carried with me since that day, and more importantly, as a warning to anyone who will listen. You see, I used to love scuba diving. I became certified when I was 16 years old, and I've dove both in freshwater and saltwater ever since. I've met and become friends with many great and talented people because of it, and Tyler was one of them. A daredevil at heart and always up for an adventure, I took him under my wing, as he was less experienced than I was and a few years younger than me. We eventually became close enough that we called each other brothers, and though we lived in different states, we always met up at least once a year to go on a scuba diving trip. That was up until the pandemic hit a few years ago. When it hit, due to the quarantines and difficulty to travel it made, we wrote off our annual meetups for 2020 and 2021. We kept in touch, but it just didn't feel the same. Then one afternoon in April of 2022, I received a phone call from him. All the usual cheerfulness and bravado seemed to have been sucked out of his voice. He told me that his work had chosen to lay him off as a way to cut back spending costs due to the strain his business had been put under, and he'd been forced to go on food stamps and cash assistance as a result of it. To make matters worse, Veronica, his long-term girlfriend of almost 7 years, had decided at the same time to break off her relationship with him. Let me tell you, that woman truly did complete him, and losing her, on top of the stress from losing his job and inability to find a new one quickly, had quite literally deflated him. I felt helpless, unable to do anything to cheer him up, standing in my kitchen holding my phone, when an idea that I'd been floating around in my head sprang to the surface. "Hey Ty," I asked, trying to fill my voice with as much excitement and mystery as I could. "I thought of something we could do that might make you feel better." "What?" he asked, his voice inflectionless and hollow, like that of a robot. "Well, I was thinking, I have a few days off coming up in the next few days from my remote work. What about just packing up, having me come drive and get you, and we go take a scuba diving trip?" I heard a slight stir on the other end of the line, but his voice remained the same. "I mean, I guess so, but where could we go? So many places are off limits due to, well, I mean, have you taken a look at the news?" A slight smile crept across my face as I prepared to spring my idea on him. "The place I'm thinking of is one where there won't be as many people right now because of the season." My smile grew wider. "What's one of the places you've wanted us to dive together the most, but we've never been able to?" A pause. "I mean, there's plenty of places. Lake Superior, the Blue Hole, the Great Barrier Reef." I cut him off. "No, I'm talking about someplace much closer to both of us." I dropped my voice low. "I'm talking about Crater Lake." There was the longest pause of the call yet, and then he spoke, his voice now filled with something I'd been hoping for, curiosity and a bit of excitement. "Crater Lake, man," he asked. "That is one place you and I have had on our bucket list for years." A hint of doubt crept into his voice. "But, I mean, how? You know as well as I do that scuba diving isn't allowed there. If we get caught..." I cut him off again. "Don't worry about that, bro. I've been doing some scouting of the area, and there aren't many park rangers in the area as there would be in the summer or fall. If we go at a certain time, we'll have a few-hour window to check out what we can and grab some quality pics and video." Another second of silence. Then, "Why the hell not? I've got nothing to lose, and this might help get my mind off the world of shit surrounding me. Let's do it, man." A grin split my face as I heard the first hint of his old self creep back in. We spoke for a few minutes longer, fine-tuning the details, and then we hung up to both get some sleep. As I walked to my bedroom, I glanced at a framed picture of the lake that hung on my wall. I couldn't help but grin as my gaze lingered for a moment more. Looking from the edges of the water to Wizard Island, I climbed into bed and drifted off into a sound sleep. That night was honestly the last decent night of sleep I ever got. The next morning, I packed all the gear we'd need into the back of my battered Ford Probe and then made the many-hour-long drive from Northern California to Salt Lake City. When he answered the door, he was clearly beyond excited. He almost seemed like a kid on Christmas morning, ready to open his presents. It was infectious. As we left back west, I couldn't help but revel in the same feeling of excitement and a bit of risk and danger we were about to undertake. After a few fill-ups, combined with many snack and restroom breaks, we passed into Oregon, stopping a final time in Klamath Falls to spend the night before entering Crater Lake National Park the next day. We told the ranger at the entrance that we were merely heading in to do some snowshoeing around the lake, showing him the snowshoes we'd bought in town as a front. After a moment of taking down our names, he smiled. "Just be careful, boys," he said. "We've had some recent snowfall, and some areas are tricky going." We thanked him, then drove up into the parking lot, getting out and retrieving our packs, attempting to hide the obvious yellow glow of our scuba tanks under them. After a few minutes' hike, we were rewarded with an amazing view of the place we'd come for. For those of you who have never seen Crater Lake, it used to be an active volcano called Mount Mazama. When the volcano collapsed about 7,000 years ago, it formed what is known as a caldera. The view is amazing. You can look from the top ridge and see the rim of the dormant volcano wrapping around and the forested sides leading down to the water's edge. On the west side of the lake lay Wizard Island, having pushed out of the water from a secondary eruption. You can also see Merriam Cone, a smaller spigot of land rising up. Tyler and I shared a grin and a high five before carefully making our way down to the shore of the lake. We looked around for a few minutes, catching a glimpse of some snowshoers disappearing into the tree line, before hiding our packs behind a rather large group of rocks and stripping off our clothes, revealing the dry suits we had on underneath them. Helping each other put on our tanks, vests, and weight belts, we made our final checks of our gear before pulling the hoods up over our heads to protect them from the cold water. I glanced at Ty as I picked up my flippers. "You ready for this, man?" I asked. He gave me a dopey grin, his trademark sign that he was beyond stoked. "Does a bear shit in the woods?" he asked, earning a shared laugh between both of us. I picked up both cameras and handed one to him. "Then let's do this while we still can," I proclaimed, slipping on the flippers and turning to walk backwards into the water. Even with the dry suit on, the water temperature still sent a small shockwave through my body. As soon as the water reached my waist, I pushed off to get myself into deeper water. A moment later, Ty joined me. Staying close to each other, we dropped below the surface, marveling at the view around us. The waters of Crater Lake are extremely clear and very blue, giving a large amount of visibility. It feels so surreal, to say the least. Flashing each other the OK sign, we pushed out towards the shoreline of Wizard Island, snapping photos and taking everything in. There had been a few other people to scuba dive here over the years, with the National Park Service approval, of course, but recreational diving was barred too, according to the reasoning that was given, not wanting to bring any invasive species of creatures into the lake, or mess up the ecosystem in any way. As we followed the rocky bottom next to the island, I felt at peace. The only sound that could be heard was the streaming of bubbles each of us made as we breathed in and out. I checked my air gauge quickly, noting that we had about 2 hours of air remaining. Plenty of time to enjoy everything, I thought to myself. The thought was interrupted by a poke in my shoulder. I glanced and saw Ty point out ahead of us. After a moment, I saw what he'd spotted. Swimming just ahead of us was a large school of kokanee salmon, one of the 2 species of fish that the lake had been stocked with. Their large, bright red bodies stood out clearly in the clear water, and it made for an amazing shot. I brought the camera up to my mask and snapped off a few photos, then noticed Ty motioning to me. He began heading out towards the salmon, and after a hesitant moment, I followed. As I followed him, I spared a glance downward and felt almost a sense of vertigo overtake me, even underwater. Not far off the shore of the island, the bottom simply drops away into nothingness. The bottom of the lake is over 1,000 feet deep, making it the deepest lake in the United States and one of the deepest in North America. It was so deep that submersibles had traversed the lake bottom before. I stared down, feeling an almost unwilling sense of unease creep over me as I noted that, for all the water's clarity, it was so deep that you couldn't see the bottom. I shook my head. Get a grip, Marcus. This is a landlocked lake, not the Pacific Ocean. There's only salmon and trout in here with you, nothing that could attack you. Refocusing, I noticed Ty had gotten a little too far ahead of me, and I kicked hard to catch up with him. He had drifted close to the school of salmon, and as I approached, I must have been making too much noise because they quickly scattered into the distance. Ty shot me a bit of an annoyed glance over his shoulder, and I raised both my hands in the universal sign for sorry. As I joined him, something caught my eye out in the distance. Something bobbing up and down in the water, a long cylindrical shape. I tapped Ty on the shoulder, then pointed. After a moment of looking, he gave a cry of excitement, the sound muffled by the regulator in his mouth. The old man of the lake. I had seen it countless times from the shore of the lake, and others from the tour boats which crisscrossed the lake in the summertime. It was a huge floating tree stump, almost 30 feet in length. The thing had become as famous as the lake itself, due to the fact that it had been floating around in the lake since at least 1896, when it had been first spotted by a man named Joseph Diller. For one reason or another, even after over 100+ years in the water, it had refused to sink, and floated freely from one side of the lake to the other. It also held a lot of superstitious significance, as in 1988, a submersible expedition tied up the stump on one side of the island, resulting in storm clouds to immediately move in. They disappeared when it was released, and thus, the legend of it being more than a dead tree began. All this flashed through my mind as I watched it bob up and down in the water like a buoy, at least a mile away from our location, deep out near the center of the lake. I spared another glance at Ty and could immediately tell what he was thinking by the look in his eyes. I knew it was one that I shared. He pointed towards it, and I held up a finger before again checking my air gauge. 2 hours left. I held it up and pointed at him. He came beside me and showed that he had roughly the same amount of air in his tank. Nodding, I pointed towards the log and gave a thumbs up. Ty gave an underwater fist pump, and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of an underwater fist pump, letting in a small amount of lake water get into my mouth around my regulator. Shaking my head, I led the way out into open water. It took us about 10 to 12 minutes to reach it, but when we did, we couldn't help but stop swimming, bobbing up and down vertically in the water as we marveled at how big it was close up. At the waterline, the top of the stump rose about 4 feet out of the water and was about 2 or 3 feet thick. Down here, though, it was much thicker. I mentally calculated that it had to be about 4 or 5 feet thick in the middle. The entire underwater section of the stump was covered in a thick green moss. It was also present much farther down in the lake, but this was the only place near the surface in which it resided. I raised my camera and snapped off a few photos, some looking head-on at the massive shape, and others looking down as it fell away from us at the few roots which clung to its bottom. Ty patted my arm and then motioned for me to go float next to the stump. He raised his camera, indicating he wanted a snapshot of me with it. I shrugged my shoulders, then fulfilled his request by kicking over a few times until I floated almost directly in front of it. As he prepared his camera for the shots, I felt an odd sensation begin to creep over me. I wouldn't call it outright fear, but it was almost uncomfortable. It felt like all the hair on my arms and legs had stood straight up underneath my dry suit. I glanced around, trying to figure out what had caused the instinctive reaction in me, but I saw nothing. I glanced at Ty and motioned for him to hurry up. He motioned for me to be patient and kept fumbling with his camera. The feeling amplified within me, now accompanied by a feeling of being watched, and not by something that you would want to have its eyes on you. I glanced around again, but aside from the stump, I saw nothing. That's when I realized something odd. All the while, before we'd been diving, we'd seen dozens of salmon and trout. Hell, the salmon population in the lake alone is over 60,000. But now, I couldn't see a single fish. A chill went up my spine. Something's not right here. As much as I wanted to shrug it away as a paranoid thought, I knew better than to ignore my instincts. I waved at Ty, but he was too preoccupied with the camera to see me. I made a grunting sound around my regulator, but I still got no response. That's when I felt something slide against my leg. It was only for a moment, but it was the most unnatural feeling I've ever felt on or over my body. It felt like bark, but alive at the same time. I shot a glance down, but saw nothing near my body. As I looked, I felt the sensation again, this time on my shoulder. I spun quickly around, so fast that I left a small trail of bubbles behind me. There was still nothing there, only the stump. Okay, fuck this shit, I thought, and began to kick back towards my friend. That was when I felt something wrap itself around my ankle. This time, however, it did not let go. In fact, it tightened, almost painfully so. I instinctively reached down to swat at whatever it was, hoping I'd frighten it off, but instead I felt something thin and hard there, still refusing to let go of my leg. I shot a glance behind me and couldn't help but let out a muffled scream at what I saw. What the fuck? The object that was gripping my ankle looked like a fucking tree root. It was thick and black and covered with green moss. That wasn't what had caused me to scream, though. What had caused that was where it had come from. It came from the goddamn stump. I could see where it had slid out from, under the very bottom of the log. And it was not alone. From the bottom and side slid out many more of the root things, for all intents and purposes looking like the roots they appeared to be, but slithering through the water in snake-like fashion. And they were coming for me. I screamed again and kicked out as hard as I could, attempting to free myself, but unable to. A blur appeared beside me, and after a moment of confusion, I realized it was Ty. He'd seen and heard my struggling, and now floated beside me, his eyes wide and full of fear. Reaching down, he attempted to pry the root from my ankle, but to no success. The other root appendages had almost reached me now, and I involuntarily let out another muffled scream, almost in defiance at my fate. In that moment, I felt with certainty that I was going to die. Ty reached down and unsheathed the knife from his ankle, and with a fury I didn't know he possessed, began slashing at the appendage that clutched me. Within a few cuts, the water began to cloud with a strange, greenish fluid. I felt the grip on my ankle loosen and unwind, and I instinctively kicked forward to fully free myself from its clutches. After a few kicks, my mind caught up with me, and I realized something. Tyler wasn't with me. I turned and was met with a horrific sight, one which I still see when I close my eyes. The reason why the root had loosened itself from me was to go after what was attacking it. Tyler. Oh my God. It had caught him by the arm he had used to slash at it with and was tightening its grip far more than it had me. I heard the sickening crunch of his wrist breaking, a sharp sound that pounded through the water along with his muffled scream. And worse, the other roots had reacted as well and had reached him. One large one, as thick around as my thigh, wrapped around his chest and squeezed. Still more of varying sizes slid in and wrapped around his arms and legs. Breaking myself free from the horrifying sight, I kicked back towards him rapidly. When the root had broken his wrist, the knife had fallen from his hand, disappearing into the depths. But I had to do something. As I approached him, however, the stump seemed to move away from me, almost to keep me just out of reach of my friend. A particularly large root made its way out beyond all the rest, but unlike the ones which were gripping Ty's body, this one lashed out like a squid's tentacle. It struck me upside the head, and my vision blurred as I spun in a circle from the impact. For several seconds, I saw nothing but fuzzy shapes, and then my vision cleared. I saw a small red cloud begin to surround me, and reached up to feel a rather large gash near my hairline. Trying to keep myself conscious, I turned back towards the stump and Ty. And I wish to God, as much of a coward as that makes me, that I hadn't. If you've ever seen John Carpenter's The Thing, you'll remember the scene where Copper attempts to defibrillate Norris, who turned out to be a thing in disguise, and how his chest had opened up like a mouth. That was the sight that greeted me as I felt frozen in place. It was opening up. The middle of the stump split apart and opened like it was on hinges. Like it was a mouth. More roots slid out from inside the darkened space, and I heard my friend let out another muffled scream as his air tank was ripped off his back by a few of them. The regulator was torn from his mouth as the appendage tossed the tank out to the side, and more wrapped around his neck and head, effectively rendering him unable to move. I tried again to kick towards him, feeling my head spin with dizziness as I fought to keep from passing out. But I already saw it was too late. The roots had a firm grip on him and rapidly pulled him back towards the opening. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. He still had his mask on, and behind the lenses I could see his eyes wide with fear as he fought in vain to free himself. Then he was pulled inside, and I heard my friend scream one last time as the opening in the stump closed. I saw a quick flash from the camera still attached to his wrist, momentarily illuminating the hellish interior, and then it sealed up. It floated further away from me, and the roots, the tendrils, retracted back. In the span of 30 seconds, it again looked like nothing more than an ordinary tree stump. Feeling a wave of nausea pass over me, as well as a growing blackness envelop the edge of my vision, I could do nothing but kick for the surface. My head broke the water into the chilly afternoon air, and I spat the regulator from my mouth. I began kicking backwards towards the shore as hard as I could, all the while keeping my eyes locked on the 4-foot-tall white shape bobbing up and down above the small waves until I reached shore, where I passed out. I awoke 2 days later in a hospital. A bandage covered my head where it had been gashed open, and it hurt like hell. I was greeted by the nurse, along with 2 policemen and the park ranger who had let us enter. After a few questions from the nurse about how I felt, I was left alone with the policeman and the ranger, who, after telling me that the snowshoers I had seen earlier that day had found me unconscious on the shoreline on their way back, proceeded to bombard me with questions. I tried explaining what had happened to them, knowing full well that I would sound insane, and not caring. They needed to know what had happened. "You've got to believe me," I shouted. "I swear I'm not making this up. The fucking thing is alive." But of course, they didn't believe me. They chalked up my story to my head injury. They also decided that Tyler had drowned, having something faulty happen to his air supply. He barely even got a mention in the local paper, just another drowning victim. I was slapped with a huge fine for illegally diving and given a lifetime ban from the national park, with the penalty of jail time if I ever stepped foot in it again. Like I ever would want to. Veronica and Tyler's parents blamed me for his death, and as much as the doctors I keep seeing tell me it wasn't, I can't help but feel consumed with guilt. After all, why shouldn't I? I mean, I was the one who thought it up. He would still be alive if it wasn't for my idea. Now, the 1-year anniversary of that horrifying day is fast approaching, only weeks away. I can't help but think about anything but it as I sit on my couch night after night and try and drown my memories and guilt with bottles of whiskey and vodka. But not even the alcohol is enough to chase away the memories of that day. Of that thing, which pretends to be a stump. One which has floated around the lake for over a century. Every year, there are a few people who reportedly drown in Crater Lake. Oftentimes, their bodies are never recovered, the lake being too deep to retrieve the remains. I'm pretty damn sure that the true reason swimmers disappear is much worse than that. Because when the camera flashed in Tyler's hand before it closed around him, I saw something that still wakes me up in the middle of the night, screaming. As it closed up, I saw the roots forcing their way into his mouth. Down his throat. I think about trees and how their roots dig into the soil to slowly extract the nutrients from it. And I shake uncontrollably at the thought that that thing might have had a similar purpose for my friend. So, I'm posting this as a warning. You can go visit Crater Lake National Park. It's a beautiful place. You can even go walk around the edge of the lake or take a tour on one of the boats. Both are perfectly safe. But whatever you do, stay the hell out of Crater Lake. The sale was classified as top secret. Whatever we were doing out there, they didn't want anybody to know. Not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the public, and certainly not the crew. We'd been kept in the dark, fed the lie that we were heading out on a routine patrol. Up and down the coast, they said, back in no time. That was before the storm, before the sea turned into a maelstrom and the night swallowed the sun. It was before the captain slit his throat, and before the crew tossed themselves overboard, desperate to escape the nightmare we'd fished out of the sea. My name is Walter Mills. I suppose I should probably use an alias, something to prevent the people above from finding me. But the truth is, I don't care. I've spent my entire life caring. My entire life running from the shadows that sit above our government, from the puppet masters that pull the strings of the world. But I'm out of time, and I mean that literally. I've got one foot in the grave. Doc says it's terminal. That means I don't have to worry about the wrong people finding me or the consequences of what I'm about to say. I can let you know. And then I can go. The sail began like any other. Our warship was tied up alongside. The crew formed up in lines running from the jetty to the lower decks, storing it full of food and supplies. It began uniform. Ordinary. Then they arrived, the secret ones. Nobody seemed to know who they were, but when they came, they wore masks of crimson, like balaclavas without holes for the eyes or mouth. They shoved past our line on the brow and told the quartermaster they needed to speak with the captain, and speak they did. I watched them from the edge of my vision, all 6 of them surrounding the captain, mumbling in words too quiet to properly make out. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and by the end, the captain was frowning. He made a call ashore, presumably to the Commodore. He seemed nervous, afraid. When the call finished, he said something dismissively to the secret ones and vanished below decks. We all wondered what was going on. For those of you that have served, you know that there's 2 things that keep a crew entertained: pirated movies and rumors. And after that exchange, the rumors flew. Some said the secret ones were special forces, so clandestine that nobody was permitted to see their faces. Others said they were intelligence operators, people with access to such sensitive intel that knowing their faces could prove a national security risk. Briggs, a stoker in the engine room, joked that they were Illuminati. Lizards from Mars. I didn't know what they were. To be honest, I didn't really care. I just wanted to get the sail over with so I could get home to see my wife, Abby, and our newborn Alice. For me, this was just a job, a stepping stone to a better life. And when we set sail, I still believed that. Then the ship dropped anchor, and the crew was mustered into the hangar. The captain stood at the front with 3 of the secret ones on either side of him. They stood silent, gazing out at us behind their crimson masks. The captain cleared his throat and said this was difficult for him to do, but prior to our departure, he received word that our mission had changed, that it was no longer routine, no longer what we expected. He passed a bottle of pills around. Each of us was instructed to take a pill from the bottle, to keep it safe, to keep it on our person at all times in case of emergency, but never to eat it otherwise. "What is it, sir?" Briggs asked in the back. "Cyanide," the captain replied. Laughter rippled across the crew. "Seriously," somebody else called. "This for malaria? Are we deploying?" The captain sighed, looking sidelong at the secret ones who remained silent, impassive. "It's cyanide, and if you know what's good for you, you'll make sure you don't lose it." With that, he stormed off, secret ones in tow. That night, Briggs died. He tried the capsule, swore up and down that the whole thing was a dumb joke, that there was no fucking way they'd give us cyanide capsules when they didn't even trust us just to clean toilets unsupervised. His last words? "It probably tastes like Smarties." Briggs died quick. He died quick in a seething, sputtering mess of shit and piss, but once his organs gave out, it only took a matter of seconds. Carrying his corpse through the ship took minutes, minutes that felt like hours. Once we'd made it to the medbay, the doc tried resuscitating him, tried pumping his stomach, but he knew as well as we all did that it was a waste of time. He was gone, long gone. The sail was classified as top secret. Whatever we were doing out there, they didn't want anybody to know. Not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the public, and certainly not the crew. We'd been kept in the dark, fed the lie that we were heading out on a routine patrol. Up and down the coast, they said, back in no time. That was before the storm, before the sea turned into a maelstrom and the night swallowed the sun. It was before the captain slit his throat, and before the crew tossed themselves overboard, desperate to escape the nightmare we'd fished out of the sea. My name is Walter Mills. I suppose I should probably use an alias, something to prevent the people above from finding me. But the truth is, I don't care. I've spent my entire life caring. My entire life running from the shadows that sit above our government, from the puppet masters that pull the strings of the world. But I'm out of time, and I mean that literally. I've got one foot in the grave. Doc says it's terminal. That means I don't have to worry about the wrong people finding me or the consequences of what I'm about to say. I can let you know. And then I can go. The sail began like any other. Our warship was tied up alongside. The crew formed up in lines running from the jetty to the lower decks, storing it full of food and supplies. It began uniform. Ordinary. Then they arrived, the secret ones. Nobody seemed to know who they were, but when they came, they wore masks of crimson, like balaclavas without holes for the eyes or mouth. They shoved past our line on the brow and told the quartermaster they needed to speak with the captain, and speak they did. I watched them from the edge of my vision, all 6 of them surrounding the captain, mumbling in words too quiet to properly make out. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and by the end, the captain was frowning. He made a call ashore, presumably to the Commodore. He seemed nervous, afraid. When the call finished, he said something dismissively to the secret ones and vanished below decks. We all wondered what was going on. For those of you that have served, you know that there's 2 things that keep a crew entertained: pirated movies and rumors. And after that exchange, the rumors flew. Some said the secret ones were special forces, so clandestine that nobody was permitted to see their faces. Others said they were intelligence operators, people with access to such sensitive intel that knowing their faces could prove a national security risk. Briggs, a stoker in the engine room, joked that they were Illuminati. Lizards from Mars. After that, we all assumed we'd turn straight around and head home. That we'd drop off Briggs' body, pay our respects, and take a couple days to grieve before resuming the mission. But the captain informed us the show would go on. We wouldn't be turning around. We wouldn't be dropped Brug's corpse because this mission was classified as a no-fail. And not only that, but the ship would be going into lockdown, shutting off all communications. River City. That meant no way to call home, no way for home to call us. We were isolated and alone, and then the captain had the nerve to tell us that things were going to get worse. That Briggs's death, tragic as it might have been, was likely to be the tip of our iceberg. The crew was furious, confused. Most of all, though, we were heartbroken. Many of us threw our cyanide capsules out, hating the memory they represented. 3 days passed after Briggs's death. 3 days of mourning, of the ship steaming through the Pacific while its crew slowly came undone, whispering theories about what we were doing out there. About what the captain meant by things getting worse. It's China, I overheard in the flats. They've got a secret weapon and we're going to dismantle it. I saw a YouTube video on this. If they catch us though, they're gonna torture the fuck out of us. So that's why they gave us the cyanide. Fuck that. You sound totally nuts. It's Russia, dummy. Gotta be. They're going nuclear, and we got word, so now we're out to sink their subs. What do you mean why? Then they can't second strike us after we glass them. It ain't genocide if we got no choice. I didn't know what to think. I'd never experienced anything like this, and so I just woke up, did my watches, and went back to bed. Rinse. Repeat. I tried not to talk about what was going on, because every time I did, Briggs inevitably came up and the memory hurt like a knife to the gut. He and I had gone through basic together, sailed up and down the Pacific Northwest, and made a game of finding old coins in every port. So I just kept my head down, did my work. I was doing that work when the captain's warning came true. When things got worse. It was a night watch and I'd been steering the ship on the bridge. One moment we were sailing through smooth waters in a bright, cloudless night, and the next moment it all disappeared. Darkness stole the evening like a light switch set to off. I recall the watch officer moving onto the bridge wings and staring up at the sky, trying to determine if the moon had slipped behind a cloud. When he came back, he looked confused, shaken. It was odd to me because we had radars, so it wasn't like we were navigating blind. He called the captain and reported that the moon was missing, gone. "Stay the course," the captain commanded. But sir, click, the line went dead. The next morning the sun never rose. The sky remained as black and haunting as the night before. Around this time, the secret ones began acting more bizarre. Whereas before they more or less stayed put in their cabins, they now wandered the ship aimlessly. They'd mumble nonsense under their breaths as you passed them in the flats. Run their hands over surfaces everywhere they went. Every so often you'd catch a couple of them heading to the upper decks with a small ham radio and a portable antenna. They'd set it up and sit there for hours. Mostly they didn't speak into the microphone, they just listened to the static buzz of the speaker. Every so often though, you'd hear them screech into the mic. Once I saw one crying into it, just weeping quietly, hands clutching the sides of their head. The crew's discussions became more erratic. Talk of Russian or Chinese superweapons mostly vanished, and now the going theory was that we were making contact with aliens, that we'd located a downed spacecraft and were attempting to communicate with it. That's why the sky's gone all fucky. It's alien cloaking technology designed to keep their craft hidden. If we get it first, then we'll be able to travel to different planets and shit. The guys in red work for Elon Musk, SpaceX. What do you mean, how do I know? I asked one. No way. I told you the Russians were gonna nuke us, and now they did. Why do you think it's so fucking dark, man? Nuclear winter. All the ash and soot blotted out the sun. Dummy. Neither theory was close to the truth. Nobody on board had any idea just how bad things were, or how bad they were gonna get. If we had, then we'd have staged a mutiny right then and there and turned the ship around, gone back the way we came. But we didn't. We sailed into the night. The following week passed in confusion and despair. The crew became more irritable. People who were usually chipper were suddenly snapping at one another, fighting over the littlest things. Errant comments became verbal meltdowns in the space of seconds. Cold coffee led to fistfights. Missing toilet paper left a sailor with a black eye and a bloody nose. But those were manageable problems, not so far out of the ordinary that we weren't equipped to understand them, to deal with them. What happened in the gym between Myers and Yendel, though? That was something none of us were equipped to deal with. Yendel was spotting Myers on the bench press. I don't know what was said, I wasn't there. All of my information is secondhand, but according to witnesses, an argument started when Yendel accused Myers of sabotaging their marriage. Words flew. Myers went to rack his bar, but Yendel kicked the bar down. 200 pounds. It nearly decapitated him. It'd been better if it had. Myers was still alive when the doc arrived. His neck had been severed badly, hanging by strips of flesh, but his eyes were still moving. His throat was still choking. Yendel sat bawling in the corner, screaming that she didn't mean to, that she never wanted to hurt him, but couldn't stop herself. She screamed as they dragged her away. As they locked her up, Myers didn't live much longer. The doc put him out of his misery the fastest way he could think of, by finishing the job. The rest of the crew got to work cleaning up the blood. As for Yendel, she died an hour later. Turns out she never threw out her cyanide capsule, and she finally got her chance to use it. At the time, I felt awful for them. Awful for Myers to suffer the way he did, and awful for Yendel because I knew exactly what she meant. That she never meant to hurt anybody. That some dark miasma had infected the ship, had seeped into our hearts and minds, and it had made us angry. Desperate. That night I thought of her, of what she must have looked like after she'd swallowed her cyanide capsule, of how easy it could have been to escape this nightmare if I'd never flushed mine. Then my thoughts turned to my wife, my daughter. Guilt filled my stomach like a pit of vipers, snapping at me for even thinking of leaving them behind. I drifted off. My dreams were messy things, hopeless, twisted. I dreamt of Briggs's spirit wandering the ship, unable to find peace so far from home, trapped in a steel cage like a rat. When I awoke, my mind felt like mush. I stumbled through the flats like a zombie, each step more plodding and heavy than the last. My ears rang. My vision blurred. I half wondered whether I'd been drugged or if there was a carbon monoxide leak in the mess, but then something caught my eye. The Secret One's cabin. Their door was cracked open, barely. It was never open. I peeked in, spotting one of them sitting at a desk with their back to me. The lights were out. A low sound played in the room, something resembling music, but decidedly off-tune and agonizing, like a violin's strings being stripped and sanded. I used it to cover my footsteps as I slipped inside, eyeing the secret one as it sat rigid in its seat. It wasn't wearing its mask. At least, not properly. It had lifted it up to its eyes, except it had none. No eyes, no nose, and only a tiny round hole that passed for a mouth. Heart-pounding, I gazed at this thing in the thin light from the flats, suddenly understanding why they were running their hands over everything on the ship. They were navigating, scouting. It lifted a finger to its face, tracing along a series of scattered wounds, some still bleeding. With a whimper, its nail plunged into its cheek. A pool of blood formed around it. The secret one moaned. Slowly, it peeled off a small strip of flesh. Then another. It placed them down on the desk, humming in tune with the distorted music, and the flesh began to writhe. It began to twist and reshape. The secret one felt it with its hands, nodded to itself. Then it pulled a file dossier from the desk, opened it up and felt for a form before scribbling something onto it and replacing it in the drawer. The cabin door creaked open. Another secret one stood in the doorway, gazing at me through its crimson mask. It cocked its head, took a step forward. My body rippled with goosebumps, wondering if this one still had its features. Its eyes. It mumbled something incoherent, and the first turned in its seat. My skull pounded. Whatever headache I'd woken up with had worsened, and now the pain was almost blinding. I stifled a groan as the first secret one rose from its chair. It approached me, and I took a quiet step backward as it reached into the locker I'd been standing in front of, removing a ham radio and a machete. My heart hit my ribcage once, twice. I wanted to faint. Then both of them left the cabin, leaving me alone. Alone with the dossier. I gave it 30 seconds before I took another breath. Then I moved to the desk drawer, took the documents from the folder, and thumbed through them. They were written like a fever dream. Symbols, numbers. Nothing about them seemed to make much sense, and it occurred to me that they were probably encrypted by some kind of code. Cursing, I stuffed them into my pocket for later analysis. I hurried to the bridge, already late for my shift. My thoughts raced as I relieved the helmsman, hastily giving my turnover report to Sandhu, the watch officer. I sat down in the chair, took the wheel, and pondered what I'd just seen. Were the secret ones some kind of cultists? Was Briggs right? Were we sailing with the goddamn Illuminati? I never got an opportunity to think it through. At that moment, the captain stumbled onto the bridge looking like death itself. I'd heard rumors he looked unwell, but this was the first time I'd seen him out of his cabin in weeks. His face was emaciated. His cheeks were so sunken that the bones looked liable to pierce his skin, and I idly wondered if he'd eaten a full meal since we'd set sail. "Evening, sir," Sandhu said. The captain mumbled something unintelligible, brushing past her and sitting down in his chair. He buckled his seatbelt. "Everything all right?" Sandhu asked. The captain looked at her, but he didn't seem to see her. His fingers gripped both sides of his armrests and his lips began to move. "Goodbye," he said. "I'm sorry? Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye." The captain sat in his chair, repeating the word over and over again as tears leaked from his eyes. "Better get the doc," Sandhu muttered. She picked up the phone, but before she could get the number dialed, an orange glow appeared beneath the bridge windows. Something flickering. "Ma'am," Ramirez reported from lookout. "Those secret types just lit a bonfire on the fucking gun deck." "What?" Sandhu rushed to the window, looking down in shock and rage. Then she moved to the bridge wing, calling down to the secret ones to put the fire out. A moment later, she screamed. Ramirez, looking out the bridge windows, suddenly turned and vomited onto the deck. "What's going on?" I asked, shooting up from my seat. "It's Yendel," Ramirez said, wiping his mouth. "It's Yendel and Briggs. They're chopping up their damn corpses." Sandhu stormed back inside, shouting at the captain. "Sir, permission to mobilize an ERT and put those assholes in confinement? Goodbye. Goodbye." Sandhu cursed. She picked up the phone and dialed the executive officer, informing them that the captain had lost it and that the secret ones were cutting up corpses, burning bodies. They needed to get people out there to shut it down now. People with weapons, because the secret ones had machetes. The XO said they were on it, but it was too little too late. Somehow, I already knew the secrets had already finished what they came to do. From deep in the night, the wind howled, screamed. A wave struck us broadside, a big one. It twisted the warship like a rubber duck in the bath, knocking Ramirez sideways and tumbling Sandu across the deck. I managed to steady myself against the helm console. "Jesus Christ," Sandu breathed. "Everybody all right?" I buckled my seatbelt. "What the hell was that?" "Rogue wave," Sandu spat. "Been 3 weeks of perfect weather and then that comes out of nowhere. This sail is cursed." She grabbed the phone and began a shipwide announcement for a rapid survey. But she never finished the pipe. Another wave struck us. Then another. Sandu's head slammed against the center console with a sickening crack, and she fell to the deck motionless. I braced against the helm, my seatbelt squeezing painfully into my waist. Nearby, I heard Ramirez shrieking, praying. The captain continued to utter his refrain, "Goodbye, goodbye." Lightning flashed. For the first time in weeks, I glimpsed the sky. Dark clouds spun around us as though caught up in a whirlwind, and in them swam faces. Shadows. They gazed down at us, anguished. I saw Yendel. Briggs. I heard them scream and howl, as though calling for somebody in a language that could only be described as blasphemous. Ramirez's body arched and twisted. He hollered as though something were picking him apart from the inside out. I wanted to jump up and help him, but I needed to keep control of the ship. Abandoning the helm in a storm like this would mean certain death. "Not like this," Ramirez moaned. Tears streamed from his eyes as he gazed up at the haunting faces of the dead swirling in the sky above. "I can't." His hands gripped the guardrails running along the bridge, and he pulled himself slowly against the violently rocking ship. Inch by inch, I gazed on helplessly as I saw him reach the hatch leading to the outside bridge wings. And I knew exactly what he intended on doing. After all, Ramirez and I had flushed our cyanide capsules together. "Don't," I called, but I couldn't think of anything else to add. Why shouldn't he? Why shouldn't I join him? He paused, looked at me. Then he pulled open the hatch, filled the bridge with the deafening bass of the storm, and threw himself into the sea. I sat there, dying in slow motion. The waves, already vicious, worsened. The swells now threatened to swallow the ship, reaching the height of skyscrapers as their walls of water crashed around us. The vessel's frame groaned, shrieked. It sounded as though the whole thing was moments away from splitting apart. And then another wave hit us, a Goliath. My neck snapped sideways as my seatbelt tore into my waist. Suddenly down was up and up was down. We tumbled in the rage of the sea, frigid water shattering the bridge windows, smothering the captain and I in wet darkness. In retrospect, I don't know why I held my breath. After all that had happened, drowning would have been easy, preferable. But I did. I think I held it for Abby and Alice, gurgling as I desperately attempted to get my bearings, until the water began to drain. All the water in the bridge poured out of the shattered windows, along with Sandu's lifeless body. I hung upside down from my seat, gasping for breath. Ahead of me, the captain did the same, appearing to have finally been shocked into lucidity once more. He was no longer muttering goodbye. Now he was gazing straight ahead, and something was gazing back at him. Something titanic. It stared at him through the broken window, its eyes like 3 orbs of swirling obsidian. The captain reached into his pocket and pulled out his knife. It was meant to cut lines, to cut ropes. I wondered if he meant to fight that thing, to stage one final defense for him and his crew, but instead he pressed it to his throat. He jammed it into one side and with a gurgling groan ripped it across with both hands. His neck exploded in a shower of blood. The creature, seemingly satisfied, looked to me then. It looked to me, and I looked back, deep into those eyes of swirling darkness. And in them I saw the abyss. I saw the void. It was as if something had bottled all the pain of humanity into a single point, compressed it down into something resembling a collapsing star, and then let it ignite. A new Big Bang. An entire universe built of our despair. I writhed and twisted in my seat. It felt like somebody had poured napalm into my skull, and I realized that thing was inside of me, that it was tasting my thoughts, my memories. I clenched my fists and set my jaw and I screamed, my throat raw, but nothing lessened the agony. The cyanide. Why the fuck had I thrown out the cyanide? It would have been so easy, so easy. Abby, that was why. Abby and my little Alice, who would grow up without her father. I couldn't punch my ticket, not if it meant leaving them behind. My thoughts rebounded against the monster, the love I had for my wife and daughter struggling against all of its emptiness. Struggling, but winning. The napalm in my skull dissipated. The screams echoing from my mouth faded to gasping breaths. A voice reached me, from somewhere distant and endless, and it told me to never return. To hold dear to what I have. Then, from beyond the shattered window, the monster's eyes closed. And so did mine. I awoke floating on a piece of debris somewhere off the coast of Guam. The waves gently sloshed against my feet. There was no sign of my ship, my crew, or the monster we'd discovered in the middle of the sea. It was quiet, peaceful. Gulls squawked overhead and a bell drew my attention. Some distance away was a small fishing vessel. It looked to have diverted course and was sailing in my direction, its crew members tiny dots shouting on the deck. They saved my life. But so did the monster in the sea. The monster I came to know as Eden. The documents I'd taken from the secret ones were badly damaged and waterlogged, but they weren't unreadable. Translating them took time, but I managed. I had help from several individuals who I won't mention here for obvious reasons, but what we discovered was haunting, terrifying. We learned that the theory of evolution is missing components, that it's not telling the full story. It tells us life originated from the primordial soup. It says that we began as basic organisms crawling out of the sea, but what it doesn't tell us is that those organisms weren't miracles. They were births. 1 billion years ago, something came to our planet from the distant cosmos, a creature of unfathomable power. It settled deep in the ocean and began to create all manner of life forms, learning as it went. Eventually, these iterations led to the creation of humanity. In an effort to assuage its own loneliness, it did something it had never before attempted, shared fragments of its own mind, its own consciousness with the human race in an effort to accelerate our evolution. It backfired. That link to its mind proved unbreakable. Even as it attempted to instill virtues within humanity to inspire us toward love, compassion, and peace, we rebelled. Our baser instincts won out. We fell again and again into cycles of violence and war, rape and murder. We poisoned Eden with our own corruption, but it persisted. It knew that to break its link to us would mean the end of humanity as we know it, that whatever empathy we have would vanish. Like a mother, it couldn't let go. It believed we could be better, if not now, then eventually. But it's been too long. The wound has festered, it's gone untreated, and Eden is paying the price. She's dying, withering away. All our hatred and greed, our thirst for destruction has reached a critical mass inside of her, and it's beginning to collapse, filling her with madness. The mother that birthed us is gone. A monster has taken its place. The secret ones know all of this. According to their documents, they believe that she intends to finally cauterize her wound, to put an end to humanity before we can put an end to her. The intention of the sail was to strike first. The terrifying thing is, they didn't seem to know what would happen when she died. Would she merely sink to the bottom of the ocean, rotting away across decades? Would all that madness leak out of her, infecting the world in a miasma of insanity? There were plenty of variables they seemed unable to account for, but there was one certainty that they were absolutely sure of: that we would lose our connection to her. We would lose our love, our empathy, our souls. And to them, survival was worth that. I don't think so. I don't think so because my empathy is the only reason I'm writing this today. My love for my daughter saved me that night. When Eden looked into my eyes, even so filled with human corruption as she was, part of her saw my need to see my family again, to care for them. I believe that's why she let me go. She saw that, though much of humanity had fallen to selfishness and greed, there were still those among us who carried her torch. There were still those with love in our hearts, and it's because of that I believe there was still love in hers. But that was many years ago now, and times have changed. Humanity has grown more twisted, more corrupt than ever. All around me I see love drying up, empathy smoldering in the embers of selfishness and unrest, and I cannot help but wonder if the secret ones succeeded in their mission. I can't help but wonder if Eden is finally dead. Many of you reading this may be too young to remember the exploding whale incident that occurred in Oregon in the late fall of 1970. Heck, I'm fairly certain that quite a few of you weren't even born yet. So I'll give you the basic overview. On November 9th, 1970, a 45-foot-long sperm whale washed ashore on the beach near Florence. For 3 days it sat there, drawing spectators and local government officials alike. After the first day or so, people were warned to stay away from it. The official reasoning given was that there was concern that curious onlookers might climb on top of the carcass and fall in addition to the putrid stench that overtook the entire beach and the threat of the body bursting. In less than 2 days, the Oregon State Highway Division was called in to dispose of it. They consulted with the Navy and many munitions experts and came to the conclusion that the best way to treat it would be like a boulder and use dynamite to blow it up. And on November 12th, with local and state news watching, they did just that, using half a ton of TNT and creating one hell of an explosion which sent chunks of whale and sand over 100 feet in the air, even crushing in the roof of a nearby parked car. That's the official story, of course. It's all a load of hogwash, though. I know, because I made the mistake of getting too close to it one night. Myself and Harvey. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, though. Let me back up. I was just a youngster back then, no more than 11 years old. I lived with my folks in Florence, which back then was much smaller and, in my opinion, a much nicer place to live than it is today. I was sitting in the kitchen, waiting for my mother to finish making me waffles and eggs before being taken to school, when my father entered, having just stepped away to receive a phone call. "What'd they want, Gordon?" my mother asked, turning to face us, causing her black and white checkered apron to swirl slightly on her waist with a spatula in her hand. My father grunted as he sat back down at the table. Darndest thing, actually. Apparently, a sperm whale managed to beach itself out on the sand. They want me and a few others to go out and take a look at it before it starts to cause a nuisance. Dad worked for the local government, specifically in the area of maintaining the beaches and parks for both locals and tourists alike. "Can you take me over to see it?" I asked excitedly. It had been years since a whale had washed ashore here, and I wanted to finally see what my father had spoken about dealing with once or twice before. But he simply shook his head. "Afraid not, kiddo," he said, tussling my hair with his hand. "This is grown-up business, and a little too dangerous to have you around." He began to chow down on the eggs and bacon my mother brought to him. "Maybe next time," he finished, speaking around bites of his food. I hung my head, feeling slightly dejected as I began to eat my waffles and eggs. When I got to school, many of the kids were talking excitedly about the whale. I heard that it's huge, black, and stinks to high heaven. Kirsty, the girl who sat next to me in math class, said to her friend in front of her. "Ooh," her friend retorted, scrunching up her nose and causing both girls to break into a fit of giggling, which was fast silenced by the teacher clearing his throat. Later, as I sat in the lunchroom, eating pizza squares and carrot sticks, my best friend Harvey came over and sat down, along with the 2 others in our friend group. "So, has your dad said anything about the whale?" Michael asked, using the sleeve of his shirt to wipe pizza sauce from his face. I shrugged my shoulders. "All he said was it washed ashore and it was too dangerous for me to go see it," I admitted. Harvey let out a loud belch after downing his chocolate milk, earning a huge laugh from our group, and a stern look of disapproval from the lunchroom monitor in the back. "I heard that it's already attracted a huge flock of seagulls and crows around it," he said after settling back. Gregory chimed in. "Yeah, and that it's covered in slime." We all looked at him and laughed. "You really need to stop reading those dime store pulp novels from your parents' bookshelf, man," Harvey said, then leaned it close, all of us doing the same. "I heard that it has super sharp and bright white teeth. That's what my older cousin Janice said when she stopped by this morning. Her and her boyfriend had gone for a walk on the beach when they saw it." Gregory looked at him. "Wait, what was your cousin doing with her boyfriend out there so early?" he asked. Harvey made a face. "Probably doing some of that gross romantic stuff," he said with a tone of disgust, each of us scrunching up our faces in a similar manner. "That's not the point, though," he continued. "The point is, none of us has seen a beached whale before." He looked around at each of us, a small, sly smile beginning to etch across his face. So, what I'm thinking is, why don't we go down there after our parents go to bed and look at it? Maybe even take some pictures with it. He pointed at me. Alan, didn't your dad just buy you that camera a few weeks ago? I nodded my head. I mean, yeah, but I began, but he cut me off. Then, why don't we make an adventure out of it and go and see it? He pressed, looking around hopefully at all of us. Michael spoke up. I can't do it tonight, Harv. My parents are going out to dinner and leaving me with a babysitter. You know I can't sneak past Michelle if my life depended on it. Harvey let out an annoyed snort. Fine, maybe not tonight, but what about tomorrow night? He asked. He looked at Gregory. What do you say, man? He asked him. Gregory sat a little lower in his seat, trying to make himself smaller. I don't know, man, he said quietly. If Mom or Dad catch me sneaking out that far, I'll get grounded for life. This time, Harvey let out a disgusted sound. You are such a little chicken shit, he spat. We all gasped at the swear. Each of us had heard our respective fathers let out the occasional curse word around us. But after I'd made the mistake of shouting, damn it, when I stubbed my toe trying to fly up the back porch steps and was rewarded with a bar of soap in my mouth for it, none of us really ever said them again. Harvey, being the member of our group who liked to break the rules the most, clearly did not care. He raised his hands and shook them in a mocking way at us. Ooh, he said, before lowering them and looking at me. What about you, Alan? He asked. Will you come with me tomorrow night? He leaned in and grinned. Or are you too much of a scaredy cat to come with me? I felt my cheeks grow hot and glared at my friend. I am not a scaredy cat, and you know it. I growled defensively at him. Who was the one who went into that abandoned house last year? I continued. Who was the one who climbed into that sewer pipe after everyone else chickened out? It was me. I sat up straight, trying to sound as unaffected and tough as I could. Then come with me, Harvey said, looking at our other two friends, and show these two chickens how to become men instead of staying little boys. His comment earned mutters and annoyed glances his way, but he was focused on me. He knew he had me, and so did I. He knew I hated being called scared or a baby, and I would always take the bait when he used the line. So darn gullible in retrospect. Finally, I looked him dead in the eye. Fine, I'll go with you, I said. Yes, he said, grinning like he had just walked into Woolworth and been told by his parents that he could choose whatever he wanted for lunch. With a root beer float. So here's what we'll do, he said, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. Meet me in back of your house in the alley at 11 tomorrow night. We'll bike across the bridge and to the dunes where the whale is. Bring your camera, and we'll get proof we were there. I was about to answer him when the bell rang, signaling that lunch was over. He shot me a thumbs up as he stood up, dumped his leftovers in the trash, and returned his tray. Michael and Gregory patted me on the shoulders as they passed by me. Good luck, man, they both said, leaving me to stare after them and wonder what on earth I'd just agreed to. I spent the entire rest of the afternoon until the end of school staring out the window, unable to concentrate on schoolwork. All I could focus on was what I was going to do with Harvey tomorrow night. When Mom picked me up at 3, I barely said anything to her about how my day went. Instead, I just looked out the window of her station wagon at the Siaslaw River and the hulking shape of the dunes on the other side. When my father got home that evening for dinner, I ran over to him as he sat in his recliner watching television. So what happened? I pestered him as he attempted to watch the news. He looked at me and gave a tired smile. It's big, all right, he said, yawning slightly, and it smells like 4-week-old garbage in the dump. They're unsure of how to get rid of it, and with that, he patted me on the head and went back to watching the screen. At dinner that evening, he spoke a little more about it to my mother when she asked about it. You know, it's strange, darling, he said as he devoured the casserole she had made. Normally, this would be a local matter, but for some reason they called in the Highway Division along with some bigwigs from the State Coast Guard and naval bases. It's stranger because I swear I saw 1 or 2 men studying it like it was some kind of specimen in a beaker, he added, before being shushed by my mother and told to finish telling him once little ears, code word for me, had gone to bed. As I lay in bed that evening, attempting to fall asleep and instead gazing around my room at the Clint Eastwood and Steve McQueen movie posters on my wall, I thought about what he'd said. Why would such important people want to look at a dead whale? I thought. What could possibly be so special about it? I shrugged it off, then turned to face the wall as I felt the first tendrils of sleep begin to seep into me. The next day went by in a blur. The words of my teachers and friends echoed in my head and went straight in one ear and out the other, bouncing around in my brain like a beach ball, but never sticking. When Mom brought me home, I told her I was going to play in the backyard for a little while. "Go upstairs and change your clothes," then, she called as I took my books upstairs. "I'll whoop your sorry behind if you get grass stains all over your nice new school clothes." I did as she said, changing into a pair of jeans and a t-shirt before discreetly grabbing my father's latest present to me, a brand new Kodak Instamatic camera and a handful of flash cubes, and heading out the back door. In our backyard sat an old, rusting Ford Model T, which had belonged to my grandfather. My father always spoke about restoring it in his memory, but never seemed to find the time to. Making sure my bike was leaning against the side of it, where it couldn't be seen by my parents, I slipped into the cab and hid the camera and flash cubes underneath the seat before stepping back out and throwing a baseball at our fence for a few hours. After dinner time, I watched a movie being shown on the TV with my father in the living room. I believe it was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and then kissed both of them goodnight and went to bed. Pretending to fall asleep, I listened, and at around 10, heard them climb the stairs and shut the door to their bedroom. I waited another 20 minutes to make sure they were asleep, then threw back the covers, revealing I still had on jeans, sneakers, and a shirt, grabbed my coat off the hook behind my door, and crept downstairs, careful not to accidentally cause the floorboards on the stairs to creak. I slipped out the back door, turning up my collar at the chilly fall night air, and breathed in deeply. "Ah," I whispered at the smell of the ocean wafting over the dunes and into town, then crept across the backyard to the darkened shape of the truck. Reaching through the open window, I retrieved the camera and flash cubes, along with a flashlight I'd swiped from under the kitchen sink, grabbed my bicycle, and wheeled it out into the alley where Harvey was waiting. I started following him when I accidentally walked into his back. Nearly crashing to the sand, I raised my light to shine on the back of his head. "What's the deal?" I hissed as my face throbbed with pain, but he shushed me, turning around and lowering my light. "There's someone there," he hissed back. "Kill your light." We both clicked ours off and listened. He was right. I could hear hushed voices coming from up the beach in the direction we were heading. "Shh," I heard Harvey whisper, and then saw him crouch forwards. For a moment, I thought about just turning around and leaving. I don't want to get in trouble. Not where Mom and Dad are going to take me to Disneyland for Christmas vacation in a few weeks. But I couldn't just leave Harvey there by himself, so I reluctantly followed him. When I reached him, I stared out at what he was looking at over the dune. I could see the dark shape of the ocean from here. It sat less than a few hundred yards from where we lay on our stomachs. We also finally saw the whale. It lay on its side, about 10 feet from the water's edge, its shape hulking and gigantic. White-lined ridges spread out the top of its back, while the rest of its shape was nothing but smooth blackness. It was easy to tell these features because currently there was a light on it, a bright one. Behind it, I could see 2 or 3 figures standing and talking amongst themselves. Then they began to walk towards us. "Down," I whispered, and Harvey and I made ourselves as small as possible behind the dune. The sound of footsteps digging in and kicking up the sand approached, and I heard a snippet of their conversation as they passed by me. "It's incredible," I heard a man say. 2 days out of the water and still maintaining vital signs. Combine this with the alterations, and I think we've discovered a whole new species, one far more predatory and dangerous than we've ever seen before. We've got to get on the horn and get this information out. They drew further away, and their conversation dimmed and grew unintelligible again. The two of us stood up. "What were they talking about?" I asked, gazing towards the darkness where they'd gone. "Who cares?" Harvey said, shaking the sand off his coat and pants. "It means we have a chance to get the pictures. Come on." And with that, he began running down the last dune to the giant, dark form on the sand. I followed, slower though. Something about the way the men had spoken had made me feel a twinge of uneasiness. Still, I plodded behind my friend towards the shape. As I drew closer, it rose higher and higher above my head until it seemed to tower over me like one of the buildings I saw when my parents took me to Portland. Harvey drew close to the side of the creature. The smell was overpowering now, and I forced myself to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. He reached out towards it. "Harvey, don't," I whispered urgently. "Nothing's going to happen, Alan," he said, putting a mocking tone as he said my name. "It's dead after all, remember?" And before I could say any more, he placed his hand on it. Immediately, he drew it back, his face a look of disgust. "Ooh," he exclaimed. "What?" I asked, afraid of what he'd say. It's slimy and cold," he said, then chuckled. "I don't believe it, Gregory was right." He chuckled again, then waved for me to follow him around the other side. Before I stepped after him, I noticed something odd. The birds had barely touched it. I followed after him slowly, and as I drew closer, I heard him gasp. "Holy shit, Alan, come look at this." Walking quickly, I rounded the edge and saw what he'd seen. The whale's mouth was huge. It yawned before us like the opening of a cave, its teeth looking like the stalactites and stalagmites at the entrance. It was wide enough that we easily could have walked inside. "Wow," I breathed, staring into the blackness beyond. "No joke," Harvey said excitedly. "It looks exactly like the whale from Moby Dick." He ran away from me, down to the other end. "And the tail is huge. It's as wide as a car," he called. I heard him run back towards me, and he reappeared in the light behind us. "You've got to take a picture of me in front of the mouth, Alan," he exclaimed. "That would be the ultimate picture to have. All the kids in school would think I'm the coolest kid there." I glanced around, looking to make sure the men weren't coming back, then pulled my camera and a flashbulb out of my coat pocket. "All right, but just a few pictures, and then we get out of here. Before they come back." I hooked a thumb back towards where they had gone. Yeah, whatever, that's fine. Just take the picture," he insisted, moving to stand towards the edge of the mouth. I looked down and pushed the flash cube into the slot at the top of the camera, then moved away about 10 feet to make sure I got as much of the whale in the shot as well as him. As I raised the viewfinder to my eye, a strange feeling came over me. It was almost the same feeling I had when I would turn to find my parents watching me out the window of the house. It was a feeling of being watched. But when I looked away from the camera, I saw nothing. Nobody. "What are you waiting for?" Harvey hissed. "Take the damn picture." Shaking my head, I again raised the camera, centered the viewfinder on him, then pressed down on the shutter button. The area for a split second lit up even brighter by the flash from the cube. And the burning smell that would come with it followed a second after. "Take another," he insisted, bending his arms up the way bodybuilders did and striking a pose. I did as he asked, but as I pressed the shutter button, something above him caught my head. High over both of our heads, I could just barely see the edge of one of the whale's eyes. It was just a tiny glimpse, but something about it seemed off. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness again, Harvey picked up a piece of driftwood from the sand, then held it out like it was a spear he was about to throw. "One more," he said, chuckling as he attempted to look like Captain Ahab. I sighed, still feeling like I was being watched, but obediently raised the camera to my eye and centered on my friend. That's when I noticed it. A flicker of motion from where I'd seen the edge of the eye. I hesitated, staring at the scene through the viewfinder, noting that there was more white there than there had been before. Did its eye just move? I lowered the camera. Harvey," I said tentatively, "you may want to get over here." He looked at me, annoyed. "I will," he said, raising the driftwood again, "after you take the damn picture." I was about to speak again when I heard shouting coming from off to the side, frantic and out of breath. I turned and saw the 3 men who had passed by us sprinting towards us, arms waving over their heads like they were trying to signal an overhead airplane. For a second, I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then it became clear. "Get away from it. For the love of God, get away from it," came a man's cry. "Harvey, we've got to go," I shouted, no longer trying to be discreet. I turned and saw him drop the piece of driftwood, a panicked look covering his face. What happened next happened in a fraction of a second. One moment, he was there, beginning to run towards me. The next, something flashed out from inside the whale's mouth as quick as a lightning bolt. I didn't get a good look at it, but from the little I did, it looked like a tongue, but not one I'd ever seen before. This looked like it split apart into 3 pieces, and it looked as though the surface of it was covered in small, sharp hooks. In that same instant, they wrapped around Harvey with the fluidity of a boa constrictor, and then he was gone, yanked back into the mouth and down its throat. He never even had time to cry out. That's when the men reached me. One grabbed me around the waist and threw me as far as they could, back towards the lights they had set up. I fell hard on my side, the air driven from my lungs. When I stared up, I felt the color drain from my face. The whale was moving, thrashing around on the sand in a frenzied attempt to reach its next meal. And it had found it. The man who had thrown me had been snagged in the clutches of its tongue, and with the same speed it had taken my friend, yanked him back into its gullet. He, however, had managed to let out the beginnings of a scream. It was choked off as he disappeared inside. I scrambled to my feet, unable to keep myself from crying, snot running down from my nose. "Run, kid!" One of the remaining 2 men shouted at me, waving at me with his arms. I took a last look at the thrashing creature on the sand and saw its eye. Its diamond-patterned eye, filled with a mix of colors from black to red. The eye focused and locked onto me, and I felt my pants dampen as I pissed myself in fear. Screaming, I turned and took the man's advice, running for my life back towards where my bike lay hidden. I barely remember getting home that night. The frantic pedaling back into town and home, along with dropping my bike into my backyard and getting back into the house, are all a blur. All I know is, the next thing I remember was my mother shaking me awake. "Alan, honey, I need you to focus and tell me something," she said seriously. "Have you seen Harvey since school yesterday?" I didn't know what to say to her. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, so instead I simply shook my head. She looked at me for a second, then nodded and went back downstairs, telling me it was time to get ready to go to school. As I got out of bed, I realized I'd dropped my camera when I ran. The entire rest of the day, my mind couldn't focus on anything but the memories of the previous night. My parents and my teachers all noticed it, but they chalked it up to worrying about my missing friend. When Michael and Gregory approached me in the cafeteria, I said nothing when they asked what happened, if we'd gone out there. I just felt numb. I kept replaying over and over in my head that image. That image of my friend being snatched and swallowed whole. It was a sight I would see for years in my dreams, waking me up wearing a sheen of cold sweat on my skin. When I got home that day, my father was looking at me strangely and also disapprovingly. "Alan, when I went out to work today, I was approached by one of the men working with the highway division," he said sternly. "He said he found this lying in the sand out there. He held something out to me, and I felt my heart begin to race as he held out my camera. My camera, which had my name written on the back." He continued, "What have I told you about taking care of your valuables, young man? This camera isn't cheap, and you can't just leave it wherever when we go to the beach, like we did last weekend." I looked up at him in surprise. He handed the camera to me. "Just be lucky that it was returned to you, and don't ever pull this again. Do you understand me?" I could do nothing but nod my head, lowering it so he couldn't see my pale face. He turned and walked away from me, and I waited until he was in the kitchen before reaching and opening the back of the camera. Inside, it was empty. The film cartridge had been taken from it, obviously by someone who didn't want anything coming back to me. I never heard from those men again. They must have deemed me as not a threat, someone who wouldn't speak about what I saw that night. So, they left me alone with my returned empty camera as enough of a message. A day or so later, I sat on the living room carpet with my father behind me in his recliner. We both watched the news reporter interviewing members of the highway division, as well as members of the public, who had been kept a quarter mile away from the black shape rising from the sand and waves. I couldn't help but shudder at the sight of it, my eyes filling with tears for my lost friend. A few moments later, everyone pulled back and the explosives were detonated, sending huge chunks of it into the air. The reporter ended the segment, interviewing spectators again and telling viewers that the remaining chunks would be buried in the sand. I got up and walked out of the living room. They hadn't blown it up for the reasons they'd said. They never blew up any whale that beached itself ashore again. Not even when over 40 beached themselves at once. 9 years later, they blew it up because it was the only way to destroy that monster. They never found a trace of Harvey. His parents spent over a year trying to locate him. His face ended up on posters and even the back of the milk cartons. I knew they'd never find him. Any trace of him was obliterated when that explosion went off. I'm 64 now. A few years ago, they aired a 50-year anniversary segment about the whale, or whatever that whale-looking creature was. And it made me remember all the repressed memories I've tried to lock away in the deepest recesses of my mind. I tried to forget again, but I cannot. So I've decided, for the betterment of my mental health, as well as possibly a way to soothe the scars on my soul, to post this here. I know nobody will believe it, but that's okay. The truth is out there now. Harvey's true fate is out there, though his parents are now long dead. Two things keep picking away at my brain, though. Even in my advanced age, I shudder to imagine if it was that dangerous beached on land, what would it be like to meet under the waves? And two, and this is perhaps what has kept me out of the ocean for all these decades, how many more of those things are out there? Dr. Franklin sealed off the airlock as I strapped myself into the pilot seat of the Nautilus, beginning to test the various systems of the ship. He hummed a tune as we worked, one I had grown frustratingly accustomed to over the course of our working together. Lost to science be damned, if I had to hear him hum the Irish Rover one more time, I would bash his head in with a wrench. After the airlock was fully sealed and Dr. Franklin was strapped into the passenger seat, I radioed in to Captain McDougal of the Avalon, whose deck the submarine was currently atop of. "All right, Captain," I spoke into the microphone. "We're all set. You can lower us into the water at your leisure." Over. There was a crackle from the speakers for a moment before Captain McDougal's voice came through. "Roger that, Dr. Schmidt. We'll have you and Dr. Franklin in the water in just a moment." Over. Even through the thick hull of the Nautilus, I could hear the whir of the crane as it slowly lifted up the submarine and began to rotate, moving us over the edge of the ship. There was a pause, and then the crane began to lower the Nautilus into the water, before finally there was a loud clunk as it was released from the crane's grasp. The speakers crackled again. "All right, Dr. Schmidt, you're free to begin your descent. You and Dr. Franklin, stay safe down there." Over. "Thanks, Captain. Over and out," I responded, before flipping a few switches and adjusting some knobs. A moment later, and the Nautilus started to slowly sink down into the depths of the ocean. This area was relatively unexplored, so we didn't have a great idea of what we'd find down there, but scans had indicated it was somewhere around 9,500 meters deep. I estimated it would take a little over an hour and a half for our little submarine to reach the bottom. The interior of the Nautilus was cramped, but not too unpleasant, with the 2 seats built for comfort in the event of long-term missions. There was a single, extremely reinforced porthole to look through, but most visibility was via the camera installed on the exterior of the craft. Bizarrely, the submarine did possess an extremely small airlock, barely enough for one person to squeeze through at a time, along with some scuba gear. This was justified in training as a method of escape in the event that the submarine was unable to fully reach the surface, but at the depths we were operating at, it seemed utterly useless. Anyone who left the safety of the submarine at, say, 6,000 meters would leave behind a body that was completely unrecognizable even if it was successfully recovered. As I pondered the ridiculousness of the airlock, Dr. Franklin began to hum the Irish Rover once again. "Will you stop that, Robert? It's getting on my nerves." He stopped humming and looked over at me sheepishly. "Sorry, Amelia," he said. "I just hum when I'm nervous is all." "There's nothing to be nervous about," I responded, perhaps a bit curtly. "Or do you not trust my piloting skills by now?" "It isn't that. It's just, don't you ever feel scared going down this deep?" There was some slight tension in Dr. Franklin's voice. I sighed, rolling my eyes as I checked our depth gauge. "You know, Robert, I swear you've got to be the only marine biologist in the world with thalassophobia." That got a chuckle out of him, and he gave a quiet, "Maybe so," in response before leaning back and closing his eyes as he tried his best to relax. I felt a little bad for him. I can kinda understand his nervousness, and I understood he was going through some tough times at the moment. His mother was currently in the hospital on life support, nearing the end of her life. He'd been offered to sit this dive out, but he had refused, insisting that it was in the best interests of scientific advancement. I couldn't help but wonder if it was just the crushing depths of the deep sea that was weighing on his mind. As the Nautilus continued on and on into the deep, the light became fainter and fainter. The various schools of fish we passed began to become fewer and fewer, until soon it felt as if we were all alone in an endless, starless night. It was slightly eerie, to be sure, even to a seasoned researcher like myself. About 15 minutes later, once we reached around a kilometer down, we found our first deep-sea organism. Slowing our descent until we stopped moving, I moved the camera to focus in on the indistinct shape on the monitor until it became clear. Floating, nearly motionless, save for the occasional movement of its fins, an anglerfish hovered there in the blackness. Its lure faintly luminesced, and its beady eyes reflected back the glow from the Nautilus's exterior lights. Dozens of sharp teeth stuck out of its half-open mouth like a fistful of needles. "Strange little bugger, isn't he?" I remarked to Dr. Franklin, who nodded slightly. "Indeed," he replied. "It looks like a specimen of Melanocetus johnsoniae to me. They have a fairly cosmopolitan distribution, so it's not too surprising to find down here. Still, good that we have a record of it." Making a note of it in the ship's log, I directed the Nautilus to once again continue its descent, leaving the anglerfish to its deep-sea wandering. 30 minutes later or thereabouts, I radioed into the Avalon. "Captain McDougal, over." A moment of static followed by a reply. "Yes, Dr. Schmidt. What news from the briny depths? Over. We are now about." I double-checked the depth gauge. 5 kilometers down, a little over halfway. So far, nothing too interesting, but we've still got quite a way to go, so I'll keep the cameras rolling. "How's the weather up there, Captain?" "Over." "It looks like a little bit of rain is coming in, Dr. Schmidt, but nothing I'd be too worried about. What's it like down there?" "Over." I peered out of the porthole into the all-consuming blackness of the water. It seemed to go on forever. "Dark and gloomy, Captain. I'll radio in once we reach the bottom. Over and out." I noticed Dr. Franklin had been quiet for a while, so I gently tapped him on the shoulder. "You all right over there, Robert?" He looked up at me, seeming almost as if he had just woken up from a dream. "Huh? What?" "Oh yes, I'm fine, Amelia. Just thinking." He seemed troubled, more nervous than normal. I looked over at him for a moment, glancing at the bags under his eyes. "You haven't gotten much sleep, have you, Robert? Something bothering you? You want to talk about it?" "I'm fine. Really, Amelia?" His face betrayed his words, however. "Come on, Robert, we've known each other for what, 12 years? I know you're stressed out about your mother, there's no shame in that. You can talk about it, you know. What's said 5,000 meters below the surface stays 5,000 meters below the surface." Dr. Franklin laughed a little, seeming relieved. "I won't lie, I am worried about her. I know it's her time soon, but knowledge doesn't make acceptance any easier. I keep thinking about the little things about her, you know? Things like how she laughs at stupid puns, how she always knocks on the door to the tune of shave and a haircut, things like that. Being alone in the darkness in this tiny submarine makes it all a bit harder to ignore. I'll feel much better once we reach the bottom and I can make myself useful." "I can understand that," I replied, gazing at the monitor which displayed nothing but blackness. "When my dad passed away a couple years back, I kept making myself stay busy. I refused to be alone with my thoughts. Eventually, I found myself on a plane flight, only to realize that in my haste, I'd completely forgotten to unpack my laptop, phone, or even a damn book from my luggage. I sat through the whole flight with only my thoughts to comfort me, and I'll admit it, I cried a lot, but by the time I landed, I felt better. It's important sometimes to let yourself think about those things. Dr. Franklin nodded but stayed silent. I noticed a tear in the corner of his eye, but didn't mention it. I just kept focusing on the controls, the monitor, and the porthole. I found myself losing track of time as we descended, just staring out into the vastness of the ocean. Even in a trench like this one and behind inches of steel, I still felt exposed. It didn't help that I could barely see a damn thing, just the occasional drift of marine snow, a glorified term for bits of fish feces and other biological detritus, and the impenetrable blackness of the deep sea. Every so often we'd encounter some sort of fish or other animal, and I'd make a note of it in the log, before I once again set the controls to continue downwards. I barely even processed when Dr. Franklin continued his humming of The Irish Rover. I was entirely too focused on the gloom. If anything, I welcomed the tune at this point. It was more soothing than the faint creaking of the submarine's hull as it adjusted to the pressure and the whir of the air processor. After what felt like eons, we reached the bottom of the trench, the depth gauge reading at 94.87, as the Nautilus gently set down in the pelagic ooze. Finally allowing myself to relax a bit, I swiveled the camera around to give us a better look at our surroundings. Not much around, just rocks and slime, though I did notice a sea cucumber feeding off of some of the detritus. As I adjusted my seat slightly and stretched a bit, Dr. Franklin sat up in his chair, pointing at the monitor. "Did you see that?" he asked, voice slightly excited. "See what? The sea cucumber? What is it, some sort of rare species or something?" I asked, my back popping as I groaned. "No, not the sea cucumber, something else. Something bigger. I don't know. I only caught a glimpse of it for a moment before it moved out of sight. We should head after it. It could be a new species." He sounded excited, a welcome change from his nervousness during the descent, so I obliged his request. Raising up the Nautilus from the ooze, I set us moving forward slowly in the direction he had indicated. The exterior light swept gently over the ocean floor as we were quietly propelled forward by the submarine's engines. Occasionally I would see something loom out of the gloomy nothingness, only to realize it was just only a rock. I was beginning to get impatient after about 5 minutes of this, whilst Dr. Franklin continued his incessant humming. "Look, Robert, I'm not seeing anything. Are you sure the stress just isn't getting to you?" "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I said softly, trying not to offend him. "No, I saw something, damn it. I don't know what, but it was real, not a stress-induced hallucination or a brief moment of pareidolia." Despite my best efforts, Dr. Franklin was getting upset, even angry. "All right, fine. So you saw something. Can you tell me what it looked like?" I replied, trying to calm him down. I glanced over the monitors, trying to get a glimpse of something, anything that might have aroused Dr. Franklin's curiosity. "I don't know quite how to describe it. I didn't get a great look at it," he said, bouncing his leg in a combination of excitement and frustration. From what little I could see, it was dark in coloration, perhaps slightly reddish, and large, huge even. I think I may have caught a glimpse of a fin, perhaps. It moved out of sight right after we hit the bottom. Maybe we disturbed it. I looked over at Dr. Franklin in alarm. "Huge? Robert, how huge are we talking here? Great white shark, sperm whale, megalodon, what?" He shook his head, eyes still focused intently on the monitor. "I don't know exactly. Like I said, I didn't get a good look at it, only catching a glimpse of what might have been the tail end, but from that brief glance, it has to be at least 12 feet long." I stopped the submarine then, setting us down in the ooze once more as I turned to face my colleague. "At least," I was practically yelling. "Robert, I don't know if you've noticed, but the Nautilus isn't a damn battleship. We've got a thick steel hull, yes, but it's not like this thing is built to stand up to Moby Dick. If we run into some kind of deep-sea predator and it decides we're prey, we could lose some valuable equipment." Dr. Franklin almost yelled back at me, but his counter-argument died on his lips as he stared out the porthole. "Oh my God," was all he had time to say before everything went to hell. There was a loud groan of metal as something crashed into the side of the Nautilus, alarms blaring as the cameras and exterior lights were smashed. Fortunately, I was well strapped in, otherwise I hesitate to wonder what may have happened. The tiny submarine tipped end over end as something huge continuously smashed into it. And all the while I cursed up a storm. After a minute or so, the buffeting stopped, and the Nautilus sank down into the ooze once again. "Robert, are you all right?" I asked, dazed and feeling a bit nauseous from motion sickness. "I'm okay," was his timid, quiet reply. I had been swearing like a sailor throughout the entire ordeal, but Dr. Franklin was entirely silent, save for a few grunts of pain and discomfort. I looked over at him and saw him staring wide-eyed at the pitch blackness through the porthole. The lights had all been destroyed, so it was impossible to see anything. The window may as well have been a black circle painted on the wall. "Did you see what hit us? What was that thing?" I questioned him frantically, trying to figure out what our next course of action should be. Dr. Franklin didn't reply. He just kept staring at the porthole, beginning to hum "The Irish Rover," faintly. I checked the control panel, noticing red flashing text which spelled out the words "propellers offline." Praying that the radio still worked, I attempted to reach the Avalon. "Mayday, mayday, the Nautilus's propulsion system is damaged, along with the cameras and exterior lights. We're gonna need to be pulled up, over." There was a painfully long moment of static. It only could have lasted a few seconds, but it felt like minutes as I waited, horrified that we could be cut off. Luckily, however, Captain McDougal answered. "Roger that, Dr. Schmidt. We've got your coordinates fixed in the system. Looks like the tracking device is still operational. We should have you up here in about 2.5 hours, depending on how fast we can get the cable down there. Hang tight, over and out." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, sighing in relief. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, but Dr. Franklin's maddening humming was getting to me. I looked up and was about to tell him to shut it, when the humming stopped suddenly. Dr. Franklin's face was pressed against the porthole, staring through it. His whole body was stiff as a board, entirely still, all of his attention focused on that tiny circular window. Happy that he was finally quiet at least, I leaned back in my seat, trying to rest a bit. I was managing to stay fairly calm given the circumstances. 15 minutes or so went by like that, with Dr. Franklin staring out the porthole while I just sat in silence. I was even starting to doze off, if I'm being honest. After the intense adrenaline rush wore off, I had become incredibly tired. My short nap was interrupted suddenly when Captain McDougal's voice came in over the radio once again. "Nautilus, this is Captain McDougal. That rain I told you not to worry about? It looks like it's turned into a bit of a storm. It's not safe for the Avalon to stick around at the moment. I'm going to take her out to quieter waters for a few hours, but we haven't forgotten about you. You should have enough supplies and power to remain down there for a couple days if you need to, but it's not going to come to that, I promise. We'll get you out as soon as we can. Hold tight down there, Amelia. Over and out." I slammed my fist on the dashboard in anger. "God damn it," I shouted, loud enough to ring in my ears due to the cramped space. Dr. Franklin shushed me, putting a finger to his lips. "Be quiet, you'll scare her off again," he said, sounding almost excited. "Scare who off?" I asked, getting a bit nervous. I didn't want to be down here with someone having a mental breakdown. Dr. Franklin motioned for me to look through the porthole, and so I did, leaning forward to get a better view. At first, I didn't see anything. With the exterior lights broken, all was blackness once again. However, as my eyes adjusted slightly, I detected a faint luminescence in the distance, an indistinct shape. I couldn't quite discern how far away it was, so I wasn't able to tell its exact size, but it seemed to be eerily anthropoid in outline, though at the time I was sure it was just a case of pareidolia. "What is that?" I muttered, more to myself than to Dr. Franklin. "Can't you tell?" he whispered, almost sounding reverent in his tone. "She's my mother." I kept staring at the distant, glowing figure, trying to make out further details, but I couldn't make out more than a vague shape. Eventually, Dr. Franklin gently tapped me on the shoulder, saying, "May I look again, please?" in an unsettlingly calm voice. Despite his apparent calmness, looking into his eyes, I could see an incredible amount of tension, like a violin string pulled so tightly it is about to snap. I knew if I were to deny his request, he would get violent. I pulled away, trying to make myself comfortable in my seat. A million questions swam in my brain, and I began to lose focus on my surroundings as I pondered all that was going on. What was that thing out there? Why does it look humanoid? Why was Dr. Franklin convinced it was his mother? As I continued thinking over my situation, I tired myself out yet again, and before I knew it, I must have fallen asleep a second time. I know, it doesn't make any sense under the circumstances, but you must understand, I didn't think I was in any immediate danger, and it's not like there was much else to do. I awoke to the sound of knocking on the hull. I could tell it wasn't coming from inside the submarine. It was too loud, like the toll of a bell. It was the old shave and a haircut knock, plain as day, too distinctive to have been a coincidental sound of the steel hull adjusting to the pressure. I shot up in my seat. Dr. Franklin was staring upwards, reverence on his face. "Mother?" he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. I moved over to the porthole, pressing my face against it, but I saw no sign of the glowing entity from before. Again, the knocking sounded against the hull, slightly louder this time, and the exact same pattern. Dr. Franklin clambered towards the airlock, hands shaking. "Don't," I shouted, reaching a hand towards him. Without a word, he swung his fist directly at my face, smashing my glasses and making my vision go black for a moment. When I came to a few moments later, Dr. Franklin was already in the airlock chamber. "Don't do it, Robert," I screamed, desperately trying to crawl over to him, but the tight confines of the Nautilus, combined with my splitting headache and lack of glasses, made movement difficult. "Goodbye, Amelia," he said, smiling as he pressed a button. The airlock door closed on my end, and I began to shriek incoherently, pounding my hands against it. I am grateful the airlock had no window to look inside the chamber. I don't think my mind could have handled watching Dr. Franklin die from the sudden pressure change. I collapsed on the floor, sobbing. I considered calling in to the Avalon for help, but I knew that the only thing they could offer in terms of assistance were words of comfort. I just kept laying there, curled up in the fetal position for several minutes, unable to process what had happened. Then I heard it. The distinctive tune of the Irish Rover played in knocks on the outer hull of the Nautilus. I looked out in the porthole in confusion, but I saw nothing. My vision was too blurry to see much of anything, even if it wasn't pitch black out there. The tune continued incessantly, getting louder and louder as it progressed. "Stop it!" I cried, plugging my fingers into my ears in vain. The knocking just kept growing louder and louder, ringing in my ears, which only added to the hellish cacophony. I began to just shriek, screaming my lungs out in a desperate attempt to block out the never-ending, agonizing sound. They say I was still screaming when they pulled me out after the storm passed, that I kept shrieking until they gave me sedatives. It's been a few weeks now, and I haven't been back to work since. I used to love the ocean. I thought it was beautiful, mysterious, and fantastic. Now I can't even go into an aquarium without having a meltdown. I don't know what was down there. I don't think it was the ghost of Dr. Franklin's mother. She died a few weeks after my experience. I don't think whatever was knocking to the tune of the Irish Rover was the departed spirit of Dr. Franklin either. The anglerfish lures in its prey with a highly specialized fin, one that glows slightly in order to be more attractive to other fish. When they get close enough, the anglerfish lunges, devouring them. That glowing figure in the distance, it makes me wonder whether or not Dr. Franklin fell victim to something quite similar. But that doesn't explain the knocking. It doesn't explain how it knew that his mother always knocked to the tune of "shave and a haircut." It doesn't explain how it knew Dr. Franklin's irritating habit of humming the Irish Rover. Did it pluck those sounds out of our brains to try and lure us outside? Am I just insane? I requested to view the video recording of our descent, but the higher-ups won't let me. They insist that the recording was corrupted and that it's unviewable. But I know the truth. In the last few seconds of their operation, the cameras must have caught a glimpse of that thing before it smashed them. They don't want the public to know about it, to cause mass panic at the knowledge that something that terrible could exist on this planet. I remember the legends of mermaids, inhuman creatures luring sailors into the waters to their deaths by pretending to be human beings. I also remember that deep-sea creatures often come up to the surface when it gets dark in order to find food. If you ever find yourself sailing at night and see or hear something that seems human floating in the water, ignore it. Go below deck and pray it goes away. I don't care if it talks to you, sings to you, begs for you to come help it. Just leave it alone, unless you want to go to a watery grave. Thursday, February 16th. This morning, I awoke violently to the most dreadful sound I've ever heard. An ear-splitting screech echoed through the hull of my boat, and the vessel came to an abrupt stop. Quickly, I crawled out of bed and tried to gather my bearings. As I exited the bedroom, my feet were greeted by a cold splash. I looked down to see the entire floorboard covered in an inch-deep carpet of seawater. Flurries of thoughts raced through my mind, and I began to fear the worst. As I wondered whether or not I had struck a reef, my eyes caught a glimpse of something sharp and rusty poking out of the wall on the starboard side of the saloon. It was some kind of metal spike, roughly 3 inches in diameter. It was about chest height and had obviously impaled the hull. Water flooded in from the small openings between the spike and the hull, in rhythm with the waves as they crashed into the boat. The pulsating water was reminiscent of gushing blood erupting from a severed artery. I rushed over to my utility closet, splashing through the water as I scuffled across the cabin. There, I began frantically rummaging through the unorganized mess of the various tools and supplies I had gathered over the years. As I searched, I could feel the water levels slowly rising. I imagined the boat as an hourglass and the water as sand. Each grain of sand that poured in through the hull only led me closer and closer to an untimely burial at sea. When I had finally located what I was looking for, I hurried over to the spike. There, I began sealing the cracks with waterproof tape reinforced with some kind of fast-drying putty. Due to the sheer size of the spike, I wasn't able to remove it completely, though I wouldn't if I could either. The spike served as a blockade, and without it, the cabin would have been flooded in mere seconds. I'm sure you've heard that you should never pull out a knife from a stab wound. This is because the knife aids in sealing up the wound, preventing even more blood from pouring out. Well, the same concept applies here. Thankfully, stopping the leakage proved to be no challenge. But now that things have quieted down, I am beginning to realize that my problems aren't over just yet. I am in the middle of the Atlantic, weeks away from the nearest continent, and I am stuck here for the foreseeable future. I went up to the deck immediately after sealing up the leak, and I discovered that the spike is actually attached to a greater structure that runs deep beneath the ocean surface. It almost seems to be some kind of large metal spire. It's covered in rust and barnacles, and a great portion of it rises several feet above the water. It has 4 sharp spikes protruding from each side, one of which is the one that has pierced my hull. I will investigate further tomorrow. Friday, February 17th. I spent the remainder of yesterday hauling floodwater out of the cabin. It took me several hours to accomplish, but at least it's dry down there again. Mostly anyway. I have also furled up all the sails on the boat, and they will remain so indefinitely unless I somehow manage to get free from the spire without a hitch, which I highly doubt. This was done so that the spike wouldn't tear open the hull again when a powerful gust of wind hits the sails. As for the spire, I am no closer to understanding what it is or why it's there. I hopped in for a swim this morning in order to better survey the structure, and as soon as I breached the surface, an overwhelming sensation of dread overcame me. I have lived by the sea my entire life and have never been affected by thalassophobia before. But seeing how deep that structure descended into the dark and murky depths below sent shivers up my spine. I don't know quite how to explain it, but the whole situation felt strange. Yes, I am aware that the structure itself is inherently an anomaly, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I felt this sort of low hum radiating through my body as I swam, and all of a sudden I felt exposed. Paranoid that something would emerge from the deep and drag me down with it, I looked down and through my swimming goggles stared into the blue abysmal ocean depths, and I swear I could feel something staring back at me. Needless to say, I quickly got back on the boat after that. I think it will be a while before I dare enter the ocean again. Friday, February 17th. Entry number 2. After my morning swim with the spire, I began attempting to establish contact with emergency services. I didn't think I would need to write another entry for today, but a couple of strange things have been happening, so I reckon it is for the best if I document everything moving forward. Firstly, radio signals seem to be wavering. Whenever I try to communicate over the airwaves, I get in return only a chorus of static with some barely intelligible chatter scattered in there somewhere. I also have an extremely weak internet connection, but considering how frail it is, I might as well be offline. I have broadcasted an SOS signal multiple times now, but I am unsure if it has actually reached anybody or not. If someone is indeed coming, it would take about a week or two to reach me, depending on what kind of ship they're using. Hopefully, my rescuers will arrive by way of aircraft, because I'm not terribly confident that my makeshift plug will last more than a few days at best, and I would hate to one morning wake up on the bottom of the ocean. I will spend the rest of my evening trying to reach the mainland, but as it stands, I don't have high hopes. I will admit, my circumstances are beginning to look more dire with each passing second, and I am starting to become increasingly worried that I will actually perish out here. Saturday, February 18th. I woke up to a small leak today, but I managed to seal it up with relative ease. I still haven't heard back from any emergency services, and the radio is no different today than it was yesterday. Contemplating my options, I sat on the deck basking in the lukewarm mid-Atlantic morning sun when I heard a strange sound. It sounded like a faint splash, sticking out from the calm ocean ambience like a sore thumb. Instinctively, I looked down, searching for the source of the sound. I scanned the azure waters without finding anything at first, and I was ready to give up when I laid my eyes on a peculiar stream of bubbles rising to the surface. As they breached the water, the signature splashing sound could be heard. Momentarily satisfied that I managed to locate the noise, I began pondering what it could actually be. I'd never seen anything like it before. Sure, I've seen bubbles before in my 10 years of sailing, but this was different. Before I had the chance to come up with a plausible explanation, they suddenly disappeared. Puzzled, I stared out into the blue expanse, looking for any trace of what could have caused them. Then I heard a familiar sound a little to my left. As I turned my head, I once again saw the focused stream of bubbles rising to the surface, only this time it was closer to the stern. I walked across the deck and resumed studying the strange phenomenon. The bubbles were too far away from the boat for it to be the cause, and the only other explanation for what it could be that I could think of was a passing submarine, or perhaps a hydrothermal vent, although it looked to be neither. Before I had the chance to reach a satisfying conclusion, the bubbles perpetually increased in size and ferocity, and it was as if that particular point in the ocean had all of a sudden turned into a raging jacuzzi. The bubbles erupted from the surface and spewed water everywhere, and I felt a few droplets trickle down my forehead. But just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished without a trace, and the ocean was put in an eerie state of tranquility. Dumbfounded, I stood there in silence, wondering if what I had just seen had even occurred, or if it was just a figment of my imagination. I got my answer pretty quickly, though, as I spotted movement writhing beneath the waves. I leaned forwards on the railing, intently inspecting the strange object that was emerging from deep below me. As it got closer, reflective shades of a greenish-white began to shimmer in the sunlight. As the creature surfaced, a quizzical grimace contoured across my face, and I was left with more questions than answers. With its belly up, the fish lifelessly rose to the top of the water. It looked to be a standard Atlantic herring, a small silver-colored fish that has provided me with many excellent meals during my time at sea. But seeing it just turn up dead like that made me feel uneasy. Surely it must have been connected to those strange bubbles, right? As I contemplated grabbing my net and fishing it out of the sea, I spotted movement in the corner of my eye. I turned around to see another herring, mere feet away from the first, also floating lifelessly in the water. Then another one surfaced a short distance away, followed by another, and then yet another. The eerie sight made my jaw drop to the floor, and I stood there perplexed, just watching the dozens of dead fish floating on the waves. I still can't wrap my mind around how or why that happened. As I said, the mysterious stream of bubbles must have been responsible in some way, but how? I wish I had an adequate internet connection so that I could Google it or something. As for the rest of the day, nothing remarkable happened. I have decided to spend the remainder of the evening inside the cozy confines of the cabin, as I feel a bit apprehensive about staying out on deck now, especially after dark. First the spire, and now this? I don't know, something just feels a bit odd. Can't wait to get the hell out of here. Sunday, February 19th. I have no idea how I didn't notice them before. Whilst preparing breakfast in the galley, I glanced over to the thick spike still pierced through the hull. I routinely inspected for leaks when my eyes caught a strange pattern engraved on the rusty surface. I put down my sizzling frying pan and walked over to investigate. Upon closer examination, I could faintly make out a series of strange patterns and symbols. They looked to be runes of some kind. I ripped out a page from this very logbook, placed it on top of the icons, and started tracing them with a pencil. Once finished, I was left with 4 otherworldly symbols. 2 of them look like a hashtag, coupled with tiny spirals scattered about, and the remaining 2 are way too intricate and detailed for me to be able to even attempt to describe. This only made me more curious as to what the purpose and origins of the spire truly are. How deep does it descend? What lies at the bottom? What does it do? These were all questions I vowed to answer, and so I came up with a plan to do so. In my late 20s, I used to work part-time as an assistant oceanographer. One of the projects I worked on required us to use these specialized deep-sea cameras to chart the bottom of a trench right by the southern coast of Argentina. These cameras were able to withstand immense pressure, up to 500 atmospheres to be exact. It also just so happens that I own one of these cameras, though I haven't used it in close to half a decade. Hopefully it will still turn on. If it doesn't, I'll just abandon the idea. My plan is to attach the recording camera to a rope and lower it to the sea floor next to the spire, in hopes that I may come closer to understanding this enigmatic structure once and for all. As I'm writing this, I just noticed some water spilling into the cabin, so I'll have to take care of that first. But after that, I'll spend the rest of the day preparing the equipment for the abysmal descent. Hopefully, I can get things ready and going by noon. If not, I'll postpone the expedition until tomorrow morning. Sunday, February 19th. Entry number 2. Thank God the camera still worked. I spent close to an hour tweaking and modifying it, restoring it to its full functionality once more. Under normal circumstances, it is possible to view the camera feed live through the use of a computer and even make real-time movements and zoom-ins with it. But for some reason, the computer is unable to maintain a steady connection with the camera for longer than a minute before everything cuts to static, so I opted for a more traditional method. The plan was to set the camera to record and then manually lower it to the seafloor. There, I'll let it sit for a couple of minutes before reeling it back up to the surface. After that, I'll connect it to the computer and review the footage. Hopefully, I will get clear imaging even though I can't control it remotely. And so I did just that. I tied a strong nylon rope around the camera and securely fastened it. I have a near endless supply of ropes and cords in my utility closet, so I was never worried about running out of depth. I picked up the equipment and went up on deck. It was the middle of the afternoon, but I still had a couple of hours left of sunlight. I tied the other end of the rope to the railing of the boat and I set the camera to record. As I walked up to the starboard side, right next to where the spire breached the surface of the water, I stared down into the cold depths below. The ocean somehow seemed darker today, coated in an unnerving veil of inky black. I shuddered for a moment, but then felt relief in the fact that it was only the camera that would get submerged and not myself. I double-checked to see if everything was still working as intended. And then I carefully lowered the camera into the water. I watched as it slowly faded from view, sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss. It was an eerie sight. As I kept on lowering the camera, I pictured all the things that could be down there. I imagined an abundance of rare deep-sea fish and creepy crustaceans with uncomfortably long limbs. You know, the sorts of things one would expect populating the ocean floor. Your typical angler fish and horseshoe crabs. Maybe even a giant squid if I was lucky. But then I wondered what else would be down there. What unnatural sights would greet me as the camera reached the base of the spire? What was at the bottom? Atlantis? Rapture? Mermaids? I'm not sure how long I stood there, endlessly lowering hundreds upon hundreds of feet of rope down into the murky sea. I glanced up and watched as the sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting everything in a serene orange hue. And then I felt the rope go limp, as if the camera had finally reached the seafloor. A jolt of excitement coursed through me, and I actually felt a bit nervous. In my mind, I pictured what the camera was looking at this very moment, and soon I would be able to view it as well. I let it sit on the bottom for a couple of minutes before I began the tedious task of reeling it back up. Things were going well until I suddenly felt a bit of resistance while pulling. I looked down and observed a strange abundance of bubbles rising to the surface, similar to the bubbles I had seen only a couple of days prior. I thought it strange but continued as usual. But then, to my utter shock and horror, the rope began violently tugging, the same way a fishing rod does once you've caught something big. I was completely perplexed, and I began panicking. I strained my arms and desperately tried to resist, but whatever force was pulling the other end of the rope was way stronger than me. The tugging became so violent that I had to let go of the rope out of fear of rope burn. I watched helplessly as more and more rope flew over the edge of the boat and disappeared into the water. Whatever it was kept dragging the camera further away from the boat. Soon, there wouldn't be enough rope left, and it would start tugging on the boat's railing. Would it break the railing? Or maybe, as absurd as it seems, start dragging the boat under? I couldn't chance it. I rushed downstairs into the cabin and grabbed the first knife I could find. I hurried back up and began severing the knot that was tied around the starboard side railing. Beside me, I could hear the sound of rope rapidly flying overboard with each passing second. A wave of relief washed over me as the knife cut the last fiber of the knot, releasing its grasp on the boat. Though it was regrettable that I had just lost my expensive deep-sea camera equipment, I was just happy to be out of harm's way. The last piece of rope sank into the ocean, and a sudden sense of serenity was cast across the waves. Everything was quiet, and the sun was setting. Cautiously, I moved toward the edge, once more staring into the hostile world below, and I questioned the events prior. My mind raced to come up with a logical explanation, but I fell short. Had a shark accidentally swallowed the camera? The force seemed a bit excessive for it to be a shark. And why would it move so fast and violently if it did? A great sadness fell upon me as I realized I would never be able to see the astonishing footage the camera had recorded, and the mysteries of the spire would forever remain unanswered. If only I had been able to view it live. As I am writing this entry, I realize that I am left with a newfound fear of the ocean now. Everything that has been happening these past few days has warped my perception of what used to be a place of happiness for me. Had the events of today even occurred? It all feels so surreal, so implausible. I think it's best that I go to bed now. It's been a rough day. But as the boat rocks up and down on the waves, I will lay in my bed and imagine the abyss and the creatures that lurk just out of reach below me. Good night. Monday, February 20th. More dead fish floated up to the surface today. At least 50 by my count. I'm apprehensive about cooking them out of fear that whatever caused their demise might still remain in their flesh as a toxin or something. The last thing I need is food poisoning. Or worse. I have also had a few strange sightings of something circling the boat. The first time I saw it was this morning when I sat on the deck doing maintenance on some lines that had twisted. I heard a kind of blowing sound, reminiscent of when a whale or dolphin surfaces to take a breath. I quickly turned around just as the culprit fully submerged itself. I wasn't able to get a clear view, but I saw a dark shadow disappear beneath the waves. Initially, I suspected it may have been an orca, and this got me a bit anxious, as killer whales have been known to attack sailboats on multiple occasions. I continued working, but remained vigilant. The next and last sighting happened in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its descent on the horizon. It had been a very humid day, and as a result, a thick layer of fog rested on top of the water. I was inspecting the peculiar weather phenomena when I initially spotted it. Way off in the distance, maybe a mile out in the ocean, I saw a dark circular shape poke out of the water, still as a statue. Thinking it may have been debris at first, strained my eyes to properly gauge what I was looking at. Glistening rays of light penetrated through the thick haze from above, and I saw the light bounce off the wet object, along with two reflective dots that stared right back at me. And then, whatever it was, blinked. The whole ordeal reminded me of that famous Theodore Kittelson painting. My heart sank as I realized that whatever I was looking at was alive and observing me just as I was observing it. I was revolted and took a step back, only to see the entity vanish under the water. A couple of hours passed since, and I was in the galley cooking supper. The strange sightings had almost slipped my mind when I heard a bone-chilling sound. Coming from the porthole behind me, I heard a distinct tapping on the window. Goosebumps flooded my body, and I didn't dare turn around, frightened by what I may have seen on the other side of that glass. The tapping continued, ominously echoing throughout the cabin. Then an ear-splitting screech filled the air. Do you know the sound a chalkboard makes when you drag your nails across it? Yeah, it sounded just like that. Against every fiber of my being telling me not to turn around, I looked over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. Nothing except for 3 distinct scratch marks running along the glass surface of the porthole. I quickly locked my cabin door, pulled over the curtains, and began writing this entry. As I'm sitting here, fearful of what lurks outside, I desperately hope that emergency services are on their way. I don't know how much longer I have. Tuesday, February 21st. The oppressive darkness of the night still dominated the sky as I awoke this morning. Confused, I checked my watch, and it read as 4:23 a.m. I wasn't due to wake up for another 3 hours, but for some reason I laid wide awake in bed, listening to the waves crashing into the sailboat. I made an attempt to look out of the small porthole situated across the room, but I saw nothing but a void. People often underestimate how dark it can actually get out at sea. In the middle of the night, it is impossible to see anything further away than where the light emitted from your boat can reach. You can't even see the water surrounding you, only a vacuum of darkness. I'm not prone to randomly waking up this early, so I laid still, listening for any out-of-place sounds. I was on high alert, and I felt slightly paranoid. Remembering the strange events of the day prior didn't exactly help either. My subconscious mind was obviously telling me that something was wrong, but I had no idea of knowing what or why. Then I heard it. A rhythmic creaking came from the deck above me. The sound was reminiscent of something heavy trudging across the boat. I sat up, intently concentrating on the noise. I heard the sound move from the front of the bow, all the way to the stern. They were slow and heavy footsteps. I was certain of it. Along with adrenaline, an immense sense of terror shot through my body, and I froze in place. A part of me speculated that it may have been people from a rescue crew, though deep down I knew it was not the case. The steps moved in a sinister manner, I could tell. My ship could have been boarded by pirates, but it was highly unlikely I would encounter them all the way out here, especially in the middle of the night. I always made sure to turn off all the lanterns on the boat before going to bed. I heard the creaks move toward the door to the cabin, and I held my breath, praying that whatever was outside couldn't get in. A series of thuds echoed through the boat, and I felt the walls tremble as something was savagely bashing against the door. Terrified, I rose out of bed and grabbed the knife that rested on the nightstand, clutching it tightly in my pale hand. I stood there motionless, listening to the deafening beating of my heart, accompanied by the banging of wood as I pointed the knife toward the bedroom door. If whatever was out there managed to get into the cabin, it could just as easily tear down the frail bedroom door. Still, it provided me with some level of comfort, knowing that there was at least one more barrier between us. But just as quickly as it had arrived, the barrage of thumping abruptly stopped, and everything fell quiet once more. The heavy steps moved away from the cabin door, and shortly after, a loud splash could be heard. Was it gone? I stood there for hours, frozen until the first rays of light danced across the waves and the sun rose on the horizon. It was only then that I felt brave enough to step out of my room and into the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place in the cabin, except for the giant, protruding spike, of course. But I dreaded opening the cabin door and stepping out on deck. What if it was still there, just waiting for me? What if it had all been a trick? Knife in hand, I finally mustered up the courage to approach the door. As I swung it open, my heart skipped a beat when I saw what greeted me. The exterior of the door was covered in scratch marks and deep indentations, and a pool of water had gathered on the floor. But that's not the sight that horrified me the most. No. Far from it. What really got me worked up was seeing the deep-sea camera that I lost yesterday sitting on the stairs leading up to the deck. It was battered and bruised, but it still remained somewhat intact. I quickly grabbed the camera and rushed inside. I booted up my PC and connected it to the camera. I didn't want to question why or how it ended up there. I was just thankful to have it back. While the footage was loading, I mentally prepared myself for the sights that it had captured. Tuesday, February 21st. Deep-sea camera footage log. The recording starts off as you would expect. I can see myself turning the camera on and then bringing it toward the edge of the boat. I throw it overboard and the camera breaches the surface of the water. As it begins to sink, bubbles flood the screen, making it hard to see anything past them. But they eventually subside, and the top of the spire is revealed. The built-in depth display on the camera tells me how deep down it is in real time. At 50 feet beneath the waves, the spire broadens and becomes thicker and more sturdy. It is still covered in rust and barnacles. However, it stands as a stark contrast against the endless blue expanse. At the 1 minute and 50 seconds mark, the haunting cry of a whale can faintly be heard in the background through the device's microphone. As the camera sinks deeper, it becomes gradually darker in the ocean. At 100 feet, it seems the spire connects to a larger, rectangular foundation, like that of the top of a skyscraper. The building is covered in algae and seaweed, and it looks to be extraordinarily derelict. Though it might resemble a skyscraper in form, the architecture is completely alien in design. It looks like it's made out of rock or maybe concrete with a few metal support beams scattered about. It also looks organic. I don't know what else to call it. I guess it kind of reminds me of that weird church in Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia, or whatever it's called. It has several ornamental lines and carvings stretching all the way down its surface. I can't understate how large this thing is. It takes up over half the screen, and the further down the camera sinks, the broader the structure becomes. At 350 feet, small cavernous orifices begin to form along the walls. The openings look like they run deep within the structure, and they seem intentional, as opposed to the product of erosion. Suddenly, a stream of bubbles obscures the camera feed, and it begins spinning uncontrollably. I lean forwards in my chair and desperately try to look beyond the bubbles, but it is useless. A deafening static sound can also be heard as the camera shambles around. Upon witnessing the extraordinary find, pits began to fill in my stomach and shivers run up my spine. A sense of dread overtook me. Who or what was the gate for? I felt nauseous just at the thought of this structure even existing in the first place, much less that it was located directly below me. The camera lingers on the gate for a while before, in a jagged motion, it starts to ascend. This must have been the point where I started reeling it in. The gate is still visible as the camera rises upwards, though it is slowly fading out of frame. However, in the final moments before the gate is out of view entirely, a rapid commotion of shadows can be seen moving behind the gate, obscuring the light between the gaps. And just as the gate completely disappears from view, one can clearly see the doors begin to open. A loud creaking sound ripples through the water as the gate unlocks, and thousands of bubbles release from the newly formed opening, partially blinding the camera. As the camera continues to ascend, fast shadows swim by in the distance just out of reach, making them impossible to identify. A low-pitched and distorted cry is picked up by the microphone. The best way to describe it would be to say it sounded like a mix between a whale's cry and a dog's bark. I haven't heard anything like it before. Something swims by right in front of the camera, and the device is sent spiraling out of control. Before it has the chance to stabilize itself, it is hit again, and this time it is shrouded in darkness, and the audio cuts out. The screen is black, but the depth display shows it descending at an impossibly fast rate. Then the feed cuts out. The video just stops. Horrified, I sat still in front of my computer, a flurry of thoughts racing through my mind, but none of them were pleasant. I examine the camera itself, and upon closer inspection see what looks to be bite marks stretched across its surface. I will spend the rest of my day fortifying the entire cabin, making sure that nothing can get in. I will make this sailboat an impenetrable fortress. I'm not taking any chances, not anymore. I have a feeling that whatever was here last night will return. Thursday, February 23rd. I'm afraid this might be my final entry. Yesterday was busy, so I didn't have time to write. I don't have much time now, so I'll try to make it short. I apologize. As mentioned earlier, I have fortified the entire sailboat, making it virtually impossible for anyone to get inside. And boy, am I glad I did. Last night, a flurry of attacks suddenly erupted from all sides of the boat. Without warning, something began aggressively scratching at the hull, banging on the door, biting at the walls, etc., etc. You get the idea. I still don't know if there are more of them, or if it is just a large singular entity, but whatever it is desperately wants to get inside the cabin. And I fear it's not just for a social visit either. Thankfully, it seems to be docile during the day, but just as soon the sun disappears from the horizon, it comes out to play. It is currently 1 hour until sundown, and I have done everything I could possibly do to prepare myself for the events that will transpire tonight. I have armed myself with several knives and done some push-ups for morale. I am almost certain this will be my end, however, as the cabin door won't withstand another attack. And to top it all off, as if my situation couldn't get any more hopeless, a steady stream of water has begun leaking in from the damn spike stuck in my hull. I can't emphasize enough how much I loathe the sight of it. That thing is the sole reason I am caught up in my horrible conundrum in the first place. I'm not sure how many days I've been out here. I think it's only been a week, but it feels like a bloody lifetime. Whatever happens tonight, my suffering here will come to an end. Though, I highly doubt I will emerge victorious. I have spent most of the day typing up all the relevant logs digitally, and hopefully, my frail internet connection is able to upload it somewhere. It will be my lasting legacy, and my story will serve as a cautionary tale to any sailors daring enough to cross the Atlantic. I can hear it outside now. Time is running out. I can hear a deep guttural growl bellow from the depths, and the sound is loud enough to send vibrations through the boat. Something is coming. This will be my final message. If you spot a giant rusty spire sticking out of the water in the middle of the ocean, stay clear of it at all costs. Whatever is down there is unfathomably ancient, and it is not made by humans. Goodbye. All right, ladies and gentlemen, gear up and be ready to enter the water in 20. That was the call I heard from Victor, our team leader, as I stood on the rear deck of the research vessel Adriatic Lass, the chilly wind and biting sea spray of the Atlantic hitting me in the face as I stared out at the dark blue waves crowned with white caps. Above my head on its tether dangled a yellow submersible, the restraints holding it in place, letting out small, soft creaks of protest as she shifted with the ship bobbing up and down in the waves, only kept in place by her anchor. I turned and looked out over the opposite side of the ship. As we were about 300 miles offshore, I couldn't see land, but I knew just over the horizon to the north lay Nantucket Island, to the west, New York City. As I looked back towards shore, a particularly nasty gust of wind slammed into my back, sending a shiver straight up my spine. I quickly flipped the collar of my coat up to protect myself, then looked around me at the others gearing up. "Mitchell, you'll be going in the submersible this time, due to your hand," he called again, striding over to check on the 4 scuba divers who were being assisted into their twin tanks and weight belts. I glanced down at the bandage on my right hand and sighed heavily. Of frigging course I had to hurt myself right before the voyage. I thought miserably. Any injury is detrimental when you're on the job. When you're a professional scuba diver and underwater surveyor, it's disastrous and can bench you. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, feeling as giddy as a kid in a candy shop with a $20 bill scrunched up in his hand. But when I distractedly looked up from fetching a late-night snack due to my wife, I'd ended up with my hands slammed in the door of our vintage refrigerator. I despaired that I'd be forced to just stay topside, letting the others have the adventure I'd waited for almost a year. But luckily for me, Victor knew how badly I wanted to go, and so had convinced Jake, our resident submersible pilot, to swap out for me at least on the first dive. The submersible, nicknamed the Halibut by the crew, lowered down until it sat on the deck, allowing me to, rather delicately, climb up and slide into the single-man cockpit. To say it was a cramped space would be understating it. You barely had room to breathe in this thing with all the gauges and pipes everywhere. It was a place that, if you had claustrophobia, would have been more or less hell. I heard someone else climb up the side, and turned my face up to find Jake's smiling face staring down at me as he began to pull the overhead hatch closed. "Don't have too much fun down there," he called to me. "Remember to save a little bit for me?" I laughed. "Don't worry, bro. I'll make sure to let you at least get the first look at the rusting propellers." He laughed at my quip, quickly flipping me the bird in a good-natured manner before closing the hatch and sealing it. Shaking my head and still chuckling to myself, I slipped into the seat and buckled myself in as I felt the winch begin to lift me off the deck. I felt a slight sense of dizziness as it rocked back and forth, watching the deck slide away under me and be replaced by the waves. Then it began to be lowered into the ocean. The rocking intensified as the halibut bobbed up and down in the waves like a cork. And I took a deep breath, fighting off the slight feeling of seasickness which had begun to creep up on me like a predator. Two safety divers swam over to me, unhooking the submersible from its tether and making final checks to be sure the outer hull was in safe condition. One of them formed his hand into the OK sign, signaling that I was good to go, and I mirrored his gesture as I slipped on my headset. "Halibut to control, all final checks have been made. We are ready for descent," I said into the mic. A short crackle of static filled my headset, and then I heard Victor's voice greet my ears. "Halibut, this is Control. You are go for descent. Enjoy the trip." "Copy that," I replied, then reached out and pulled a handle to my right. The sound of the submersible's ballast tanks emptying filled my ears, and with a last look at the cloudy sky over my head, I slipped below the waves. Instantly, the dizzying feeling left me, and I felt a growing sensation of happiness flow through me. I'm home. Ever since I'd been a child, I'd been in love with the ocean, and I'd felt more at home when I was in it, and especially underwater, than I did on land. It was why I'd worked to get my oceanography degree from Florida State, and then spent another couple years getting certified for deep water diving, both as a submersible pilot and a diver. I'd excelled at my studies so greatly that a private research and surveying corporation, which I won't name, hired me as soon as I graduated. I spent years diving on shipwrecks and other archaeological sites. By the age of 33, I'd already visited the wrecks of the Titanic, the Lusitania, and countless others. But the wreck I was heading to now had been one of the ones I'd looked forward to the most. I looked at the depth gauge near the small porthole window to the outside. "Passing 50 feet, I said into my mic. "Only about 200 feet to go," I thought. The light had already begun to fade from the surrounding ocean, and I felt a small pang of excitement and fear shoot through me. Some people may find venturing into the depths of the ocean where little to no light can reach utterly terrifying. For me, it was an adventure I looked forward to every time. I loved seeing the deep ocean creatures swimming past my window, loved the sounds of being far down. Because sound travels farther in water than air, you can hear the call of a whale hundreds of miles away, and the sound is equal parts haunting and beautiful. And contrary to popular belief, underwater is not silent, especially in a submersible. You can hear the sound of the current rushing by outside quite often. It almost sounds like what I imagine the winds on another planet to be like to hear. I tapped the mic. "Victor, you mind if I put on some music to keep myself company while I head down?" There was another burst of static. "No problem at all, Mitch," I heard him say. "Just don't play it so loud you can't hear me. The divers are in the water, and they'll be beginning their descent in 10 minutes. I grinned. "Copy that, I'll be waiting for them down there," I said, then turned to a small, wall-mounted yellow boombox to my right. As I watched the depth gauge pass 100 feet, I pulled a cracked CD case from under the seat and dropped the disc into the player. A few moments later, the small cabin was filled with the husky, seductive voice of Diana Dorse as she began to sing Imagination. I leaned back into the seat, my smile widening. The golden age of Hollywood singer and actress was always my choice of soundtrack for my dives in the sub. I watched the gauges, then let my gaze flick over to a small, black and white photograph of what I'd be seeing shortly. The Andrea Doria. The ship had been my unicorn, the one I'd wanted to dive on and see ever since I'd been a child and learned about her, and her sad fate. She'd been one of the more luxurious ocean liners in the Italian fleet, steaming back and forth from Europe to the US ever since she'd gone into service in 1953. That was, until the fateful day on July 25th, 1956, when, during a passage through a particularly thick fog bank, she'd collided with another ship, the Stockholm. The Swedish ocean liner had been badly injured, but still managed to make it back to New York Harbor. The Andrea Doria, however, hadn't been so lucky. Having been struck at a 90-degree angle, and in a way which penetrated her fuel tanks and caused her watertight compartment system to fail, she'd listed severely to one side, and the following morning, she'd floundered and slipped below the waves, all while being filmed and photographed by planes flying overhead. The accident claimed the lives of 51 people, 46 on the Andrea Doria, and 5 aboard the Stockholm. It'd been the deadliest maritime accident since the Titanic. I thought about this as I listened to the music, Diana's voice shifting into roller coaster blues. It always gave me a bit of an eerie feeling, knowing I was going to a place which, for many, had been where their lives had been snuffed out. For a moment, the thought made the now dark ocean outside the porthole take on a slightly sinister atmosphere, and the childish part of my mind raced with images of slimy, shimmering monsters slipping through the depths, their mouths poised open to snatch anything unsuspecting in their path. I shook my head. "Get a grip, Mitchell. It's a shipwreck, not a haunted house, and not a horror movie." I glanced at the depth gauge. "Passing 130 feet, I said into the mic, then leaned towards the porthole. The eerie emotion and thoughts had slipped away, and I was once again gripped by excitement. In less than 10 minutes, I'd be flicking on the outside lights and seeing her for the first time. "Copy that, Mitch," Victor said. "The divers are moving down the anchor line. They'll have about half an hour to 45 minutes bottom time before having to ascend to complete their decompression stops." I copied, knowing that somewhere above, the other 4 were swimming down the huge anchor chain towards me. As I reached 140 feet, I reached out and flipped the switches for the exterior lights. Instantly, the darkness which had surrounded me for the last 20 minutes was banished away, both from the porthole and hull-mounted cameras, which fed back to screens around me. I felt my pulse quicken as I suddenly caught a glimpse of something floating out of the darkness. The thoughts of monsters returned with a vengeance for a moment, until I realized what I was seeing. Nets. It's fishing nets. The wreck had caught many fishing nets over the course of the Creepypastas. Close to 66 years she'd sat on the ocean floor, making it more than a bit of a hazard for divers and submersibles alike. The wreck had already claimed the lives of multiple scuba divers over the years for that exact reason. It suddenly dawned on me that it meant I had to be almost directly on top of the wreck, a very dangerous place for me to be. Cursing softly to myself, I gripped the joystick with a slightly sweaty hand and maneuvered the halibut about 100 feet to the left, turning it to face where I'd come from. And I finally saw, with my own eyes, what I'd waited to see for decades. "Holy shit," I breathed out softly. I'd been right to move when I had. I almost forgot she was 90 feet wide. Directly in front of me, the porthole was filled with nothing but the immense shape of the ship's portside hull, which had heaps of rust accumulating on it. You could barely see the black and white paint, which once adorned the hull, except for in very small patches. Glancing at the screens for the left and right cameras, I saw that I was almost directly in the midsection of the ship. Both the fore and aft sections of the ship stretched away from me out into the darkness beyond the lights. I reached out and hit pause on the music, hitting the record button on the cameras. I tapped the mic. Control, this is the Halibut. We have found the Doria. Through the headset, I could hear the team back topside clap and congratulate each other, and then Victor spoke. Copy that, Halibut. How's she looking? I maneuvered the submersible a little further away from the wreck, looking down at her where she lay on her starboard side on the ocean floor. I tapped my mic again. Well, the experts were right. She's disintegrating in the currents rather quickly. The entire top of her has basically fallen away, revealing the inner compartments and rooms. I stared at the massive gaping hole running down the middle of the once great ship where the bridge, upper decks, and first-class cabins had once been. Seeing her like this filled me with a giant pang of sadness as I quickly glanced at the photo of her in her glory days. From that beauty to this, I continued. The fishing nets we got reports of are still here, so warn the divers to stay clear of them. And the great opening will likely be the best way for them to enter the ship. There was a larger burst of static as I felt a rather strong gust of ocean current hit the sub, jostling it slightly, the rushing sound of cold water likely coming from the Labrador Current past me. Copy that. We'll pass the message along, Victor said, but I wasn't listening any longer. My eyes were fixated on a camera pointed down and to the left, facing into the interior of the ship. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd caught the glimpse of something darting across the screen, something I hadn't been able to see properly. All I knew was that it had been extremely fast. What the hell was that? I kept staring at the screen, waiting to see if it would show up again. Mitch, everything all right? I started as Victor's voice filled my ears again, knocking me out of the almost trance-like state I'd fallen into. Yeah, sorry about that, Vic. I copy your last, I said, my voice trailing off. You sure? His voice held a slightly concerned tone. I debated for a moment, not telling him what I'd seen, then decided to come clean. Keeping secrets down here could cost both myself and the divers soon to arrive their lives. Yeah, just I swear I caught a glimpse of something moving through the wreck, closer to the starboard side, I admitted. What'd it look like? He asked, sounding both curious and wary. I honestly didn't see enough of it to know. It was just a quick flash and then gone, I replied. There was a moment's pause as I heard him talking with the others, then his voice came back strong. Copy that. The guys up here say that it likely was just a fish moving through the wreck, but keep an eye out for it again regardless. I was about to acknowledge him when I heard another voice cut through the speakers. Control, this is Andrews. We've reached the bottom and can see the lights of the Halibut off to our left. It was Bradley, the leader of the 4-person diving team, speaking through a microphone mounted in his mask. Copy that, Andrews. Proceed to the sub, then prepare for entry to the wreck. You've got 20 minutes to work now. Unlike myself, the diving team only had a short time to stay at these depths. They had to ascend back to the surface slowly and stop at certain points to make sure the gases formed in their bodies from being so deep didn't cause them to develop the bends, which could be fatal. Almost as if on cue, I saw the small lights of the 4 divers appear, followed by themselves as they swam into the range of the submersible's lights. Enjoying the view, Mitch? I heard Stephanie, one of the other divers, ask me over the comms. I shook my head, allowing a small smile to creep back on my face at the sound of excitement in her voice. Even starting to go, she's still gorgeous, I admitted. She's not what she used to be, is she? Pedro, another of the divers, joked. I wouldn't book a first-class ticket on her now, that's for sure, said the final member of the diving team, Grace. All right, enough with the jokes, Bradley said seriously. We don't have much time. I saw him wave to me. Mitchell, keep the lights on the exposed intersection, he said, gesturing with his hand. We're going to enter now and be back out in. He checked the diving watch on his wrist. 15 minutes, I nodded. Copy that, Brad, I said. Be safe and enjoy yourself. I allowed a wistful tone to creep into my voice. I wish I was going in with you guys. Bradley allowed himself a small chuckle. As do I, my friend. As do I. And with that, they turned and swam away from the sub, towards the wreck. I watched them go, seeing them flick on more powerful lights as they reached the hulk. I saw them split into 2 teams of 2, one entering a passageway towards the stern section, and another towards the bow. I tapped my mic. Control, they're inside. Starting the clock. I reached over and hit a digital timer, which began to count down from 15 minutes. Copy that, halibut, Victor said simply, then clicked off. For a few minutes, I was left alone, listening to the sound of a whale echoing off from somewhere much farther out to sea, along with the whirring of the sub's thrusters and the roar of the currents. Then I heard Bradley speak, his voice slightly muffled by the layer of static due to the ship's hull in the way. Mitchell, Stephanie, and I have reached what has to be a galley of some sort, he said with a tone of awe. This place is incredible. I felt a pang of jealousy tear through me, but bit it back. Copy that, Brad, I said as I heard another voice come through the headset. Mitch, this is Grace. Pedro and I have reached a passageway. We're going down a deck. Copy that, I said. Make sure to mark your path so you can find your way back. She acknowledged, then clicked off. As I stared, listening to the two teams move through the ship, I thought about the hidden treasure locked deep within the cargo hold. A rare concept car from the mid-50s called the Chrysler Norseman, which had been on the way to an auto show aboard the doomed ship. It's probably little more than the rubber tires and metal shavings by now, I thought. As I daydreamed, I again caught a glimpse of movement on one of the cameras, this time from one facing to the right. It'd been the same vague shape I'd seen before, but this one had seemed different somehow. I tapped my mic. Hey Brad, did either your team or Grace's just stick their head out of one of the passageways? I asked, hoping he'd tell me yes, but the answer I received was not the one I'd wanted. Negative, Mitch. We're both deep inside the ship. Why? I felt my pulse quicken slightly and swallowed. I tried to force it away, but the two appearances on the cameras had slithered underneath my mental defenses, making me feel as though insects had burrowed under my skin. I just thought I saw something on one of the cameras, twice now, darting around in the wreck. I forced my voice to remain cool and calm. Do me a favor and keep an eye out, all of you guys. There was a moment of silence. Grace, you heard him? Keep an eye out? Copy, I heard Grace say, her voice sounding a little worried. Sharks, eels, and other creatures love to inhabit shipwrecks. The last thing that needed to happen was for the guys to bump into one in a confined space. I looked at the clock. 9 minutes until they come back out. I thought with a bit of relief that time was passing so quickly. That's when I heard Stephanie's voice come through the comms. Hey Mitch, did you see that down at the end of the corridor there? She asked quietly. No, I didn't, I heard him answer. I swear I saw something looking out at us from a doorway or something, she said. After a second, I heard him answer her. Well, we've got about 8 minutes left. Let's go take a look. Before I could tell them to be careful, I heard Pedro's voice speak. Hey, Grace, take a look over there, I heard him exclaim. I saw it, I heard her say. What the hell was it? A chill crashed over me, as if the hatch above me had opened and allowed the ocean to rush in. They're both seeing something in there. Something wasn't right. All my instincts were telling me so. I tapped my mic. Control. This is the halibut. Both Brad and Grace's teams are seeing something in the ship, but are unable to make out what it is. I couldn't help a small shake in my voice. Victor, something isn't copacetic here. I'm recommending pulling them all out and head for the surface. There was a huge burst of static, louder and longer than I'd heard before. I thought I heard Victor's voice somewhere within it, but after a moment, it dropped out completely, leaving only silence. I pulled off the headphones and stared at them, running my hands down the wire to make sure I hadn't accidentally unplugged them. What the hell is going on? We're only 220 feet down. This hasn't failed us, even when we were 2.5 miles underwater. As I fumbled with the headset, I froze as a sensation fell over me. It was the feeling of being watched, and in a one-man submersible over 200 feet in the dark ocean, it was one that I'd never experienced before. I forced my eyes over to the small porthole, half expecting to see a giant eye pressing against the glass. Nothing was there. But the feeling remained, filling me with a sense of dread I'd never had when diving before. I had begun to put the headset back on when a sound blared out, causing me to let out a short yell. It was the boombox. Somehow, the music had begun to play again. Only now, it was playing out of more than just the stereo's speakers. We'd wired it to play out of an underwater speaker mounted on top of the submersible for when doing more shallow water dives, to give the divers something to listen to while working, though we always kept it shut off during deep ocean dives. Now, though, it had turned on, and the music was blasting out into the ocean, along with inside the sub. I jammed the headset back on my head and began to fumble with the boombox's controls, trying to turn the music off. But no matter what I pressed or how hard I hit it, it refused to stop playing. Nor would the speaker turn off. "Mitchell, Bradley here. What the hell are you doing?" I heard Bradley call through the headset. "I'm not doing anything," I yelled. The music turned on for no reason. As I fought to regain control over the CD, I heard him call for everyone to leave the ship. As I was left alone again for a moment, I suddenly realized something. The song playing wasn't the next one on the track list. It was one from the beginning of the disc. Diana was singing the first track, a song called "The Point of No Return." For some reason, the realization of the song caused another shiver to shoot up my spine as I listened to her singing about being beyond the point of no return, asking why not give in and to let yourself go. That's when I heard Bradley's voice. "Stephanie, what the hell is that?" The tone of his voice held something I'd never heard before. Fear. The man was an experienced ex-Navy diver, someone who'd done underwater combat. He'd never lost it over anything. Not even a pack of aggressive Humboldt squid off the coast of California. To hear him palpably afraid made me feel beyond terrified. Oh God," I heard Stephanie gasp out. A second later, Grace's voice stabbed into my ears, filled with panic. "Mitchell, there's something in here with us," she shouted. "Oh fuck me, there's more of them," Pedro screamed. "They're all around us." That had been from Stephanie. I jammed down the transmit button. "Guys, get out of there right now," I ordered, my own voice shaking, but the comms were filled with chaos. "Jesus, there's at least 10 or 20 of them coming from all directions," Bradley called. "Stephanie, in here." At the same time, Grace called out to me. "Mitchell, there's at least 20 or 25 coming out of the dark towards us. We can't tell what they are. They're just shadows out of the lights." Pedro cut it. "Oh my God, that can't be." His voice trailed off, and then the entire channel was taken over by an almost painful burst of static. I stabbed the transmit button. "Grace, Pedro, Stephanie, Brad. Anyone, answer me." The only thing I received was static as the song began to repeat itself. I put my hand to my mouth, feeling horror like I'd never felt flow through me. "I've got to try the surface again." I reached for the switch to swap over to the surface channel again, when multiple ear-piercing sounds assaulted my ears. As I listened to it, I felt the blood in my veins freeze into ice. It was the sound of my 4 coworkers, my 4 friends, screaming. They were all screaming at the same time, each wail overlapping the other. All of them sounded as though they were being tortured in the worst possible way. It was the most horrific pain sound I'd ever heard. For what had to be less than 20 seconds, but what felt like an eternity, they continued to scream. Never drawing in breath, just unending screams which I would have thought would have torn their vocal cords before all comms cut to static. My breathing came in short, ragged gasps as I fought to keep myself from falling into a panic attack. "Oh fuck. Oh fuck. Oh fuck." It kept repeating itself in my head. Tears began to fall from my face, both for my friends and the amount of fear sweeping through me like snake's venom. That's how they found me. Curled up in a ball on the pilot's seat, unable to stop crying. They immediately pulled me out, and after patching up my head wound, took me to the ship's hyperbaric chamber, fearing my rapid ascent had given me the bends. After a few days of observation, I was allowed out, where Victor pulled me by myself into an empty room. "What the hell happened down there?" he asked, almost desperately. I almost lied to him, fearing I'd be slapped with some sort of post-traumatic disorder label. But I came clean, telling him everything I'd seen and heard, not to mention experienced at the end. He was silent for a long time, then led me out to the rear deck of the ship. We had already begun steaming back to port. As we approached the stern where the halibut dangled from her hook, he wordlessly pointed to it. I couldn't help but gasp as I finally got to see her after surfacing. Almost every square inch of her exterior hull had multiple dents in the sturdy metal. Normally, it would take having to slam straight into a wreck or reef to cause even a tiny dent to show up, but it looked like someone with the strength of Superman had taken a baseball bat to it. My jaw hanging open, I turned to Victor, who said nothing. He said nothing more for the rest of the trip back. There was a huge inquiry when we got back to shore, both by the company and the Coast Guard. We all were forced to take the stand in a closed hearing that, I found out later, nobody knew about. Many divers had died on the wreck before, but this was the single biggest diving disaster that had ever happened on it. After a long deliberation, the committee overseeing everything came to the conclusion that it had been negligence on the part of Victor and the others on the surface, which had led to the 4 deaths. As I was trapped in the sub, I could do nothing to help and was therefore absolved of anything. But Victor and the entire team were fired and fined massively. The committee also declared that nobody, aside from the people in the room, would ever know that they had died inside the wreck. They gave some asinine excuse as to why, which I didn't pay too much attention to. The families of the 4 were told they had died on another diving expedition and that their bodies were too deep to be recovered. We were all forced to sign a metric fuck ton of NDAs, warning of jail time if we ever attempted to tell the press or anyone else. Which, I'm breaking by posting this here. I honestly couldn't give a damn at this point, anyways. I immediately quit my job with the company as soon as it all ended. They gave me a nice parting bonus, saying it was for years of loyal service. I knew it was actually hush money. I can't even look at the ocean now without feeling as though I'm going to begin screaming my head off, and my dreams are constantly plagued with nightmares, always going back to that tiny, cramped space, hearing my friends scream somewhere inside the wreck, hearing that damn song repeating itself, almost like it had been a message, and seeing what I had through the porthole in the dim light. Listen, I'm posting this both to finally share what happened to them, to me, and to give you a warning. Especially to scuba divers and other researchers. You need to stay away from the wreck of the Andrea Doria. Everyone does. It's not safe. Let it rust and rot away until it's nothing more than a pile of metal lying on the seabed. And even then, stay far away, because the ship still has occupants. And I think that the divers who have lost their lives over the years didn't just drown in the nets or get lost inside. Not all of them, at least. Why do I think that? Because of what I saw out of that porthole, pressed up against the glass. Something which was worse than any sea monster I could have seen. Something that causes me to constantly wake up screaming in the middle of the night. I saw a hand, a human hand,